Trial in British legal history.
If it was alleged that someone had died as a result of eating a McDonald's hamburger, that would be investigated, would it?
I'm sure it would, yes.
So if people said McDonald's food is junk food?
It is not junk food in my book.
What is objected to in this leaflet is not the suggestion that McDonald's is junk food, but that it kills its customers.
Cancer.
McLibel! Torture!
McDonald's. Rip-off.
Court number 35, the Royal Courts of Justice in the Strand in London. For almost 3 years, the scene of a David and Goliath battle between one of the world's biggest corporations and two London anarchists. The corporation is McDonald's, who are suing Helen Steele and Dave Morris for libel over claims in this leaflet, published by London Greenpeace, which should not be confused with Greenpeace International. The leaflet claims that McDonald's have tortured animals reared for slaughter, destroyed rainforests to raise beef, caused food poisoning, exploited their staff, exploited children by advertising, and worst of all, sold food linked with heart disease and cancer. McDonald's are represented in court by Richard Rampton QC. And since there's no legal aid available for libel cases, Morris and Steele must defend themselves. The judge, Mr. Justice Bell, was appointed a High Court judge in 1993 and was then almost immediately given charge of this trial. This is the first time he's presided over a libel case. Richard Rampton is one of the country's top libel barristers who was featured in many headline-grabbing libel cases, including the action brought by soap star Gillian Tailforth against the News of the World. His fee is said to be £2,000 a day. Dave Morris is an unemployed postman who, as a single parent with a young child, gets income support of £76.50 a week. Helen Steele is a former gardener who, during the trial, works weekends behind the bar in a nightclub for £64 a week. The trial is a clash of two cultures, a battle of jeans and jumpers against wigs and gowns. Originally estimated to take 4 to 6 weeks, the court will now hear evidence for a record-breaking 313 days, making it the longest trial in English legal history. Oberon Waugh, columnist son of the famous novelist Evelyn Waugh, calls the trial the best free entertainment in town. It's easy to see what he means. There's the homespun corporate philosophy of the American senior vice president of McDonald's, Robert McKinley Beavers.
I've used the phrase before, and it has to do with McDonald's culture. The business is almost magical to some of us. I mean, in the sense that you feel so motivated, so involved in working with different aspects of McDonald's that we have often used the phrase, many of us old-timers. And I characterize myself, my lord, as an old-timer. That is, if you were to cut us, you know, we would probably...
Bleed ketchup.
Bleed ketchup, yes.
Apart from spoiling Mr. Beaver's punchline, during the course of this marathon hearing, Helen Steele will often cross swords with Mr. Rampton as well.
I should have had notice of this. The defendants have had a whole week in which to give me notice, and they haven't done it. Makes me very angry. Very funny, I know, for the defendants, because they're not spending any money in this case, but my clients are.
We're just spending our whole lives, thank you very much, Mr. Rampton.
And Dave Morris has his own way of objecting to Mr. Rampton.
Lord, I'm trying to listen to the witness. The witness is giving his answer to the question. Can I hear the answer?
Lord, I am making an objection.
And I'm making an objection to Mr. Rampton making an objection.
No. You can't do that.
Then, as the trial reached the halfway stage, with the end nowhere yet in sight, Mr. Justice Bell will try to encourage the defendants to be more realistic about their expectations.
It's no use saying that you want the truth to come out, because justice, it's not an absolute concept. It involves all sorts of things, like getting litigation over reasonably promptly, and one party or the other not being put to unnecessary expense. Things like that.
It won't be until next month, almost 3 years after the trial started in June 1994, that Mr. Justice Bell will finally deliver his judgment. This is the extraordinary story of that trial. Tonight and tomorrow we present reconstructions of its key stages. What you hear is exactly what happened. We begin with the opening speeches.
This action, as your lordship knows, is a libel action. The plaintiffs sue on a leaflet entitled, "What's Wrong with McDonald's? Everything They Don't Want You to Know," which the plaintiffs assert contains numerous statements which are highly defamatory and false in every material respect, and which the defendants distributed on various occasions in late 1989 and early 1990. The plaintiffs resolved they must try to put a stop to it, and instructed 2 firms of inquiry agents to investigate the matter. Employees of these 2 firms attended meetings of the London Greenpeace group and found it to be a group of people whose view of the world was, to use their own words, anarchist, and whose principal objective appeared to be the destruction or dismantling of organized society as we know it, and in particular of capitalism. The investigators found David Morris and Helen Steele to be leading lights in the group.
The man given the task of hiring the 2 firms of inquiry agents to infiltrate London Greenpeace was Vice President of McDonald's, Sid Nicholson. He'll be giving evidence later in the trial, but for now he watched from the courtroom seat he occupied throughout the whole of the trial, his office he called it, as Helen Steele and Dave Morris delivered their opening speeches.
There's one word to sum up what this case is about, and that word is censorship. McDonald's are using the libel laws of this country to censor and silence their critics. This didn't start with our case. They've threatened numerous other organisations and individuals with legal action for criticising their practices. And many who have apologised did so because of the huge difficulties in fighting a libel case, not because they believed they'd libelled McDonald's. They've brought this case expecting that we too would cave in, apologise, and therefore be silenced. We did not, and we will not.
On that side, we have McDonald's with an annual turnover of $24 billion. On this side, we have 2 unwaged members of the public, but not only us on this side, also the people they exploit. They exploit consumers, they exploit staff workers, they exploit children with advertising, they exploit animals, and they exploit the environment. In this case, there is no jury. We are asking you, the judge, and the public as a whole, to be our jury.
The fact that there is no jury is a sore point for Morris and Steele. They wanted one, but this request was rejected by Mr. Justice Bell and the Court of Appeal on the grounds that a jury of ordinary people would have difficulty understanding complicated scientific evidence. We'll be hearing some of that evidence later, but among the first topics to be examined was that of advertising. And the first witness was Mr. Paul Preston.
Shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Mr. Preston, are your full names Paul Preston?
Paul Stephen Preston, yes.
Mr. Preston, may we detect you are an American by origin?
I am.
Are you the President and Chief Executive Officer of McDonald's Restaurants Limited, the United Kingdom subsidiary of McDonald's Corporation in Illinois?
I am.
Can we deduce from that that you are what we might facetiously call the Big Mac in this country?
Yes, I am, and I'm proud of it.
Mr. Preston, your company has brought this action on that leaflet. Do you recognize it?
I do.
This is an enlarged facsimile of the original. Have you considered the contents of that leaflet?
I have.
May I pass up, my lad, a copy in the same form? Mr. President, I want to ask you about some assertions that are made in the course of this leaflet. Notice the heading, McDisease, McDeadly, and then the question at the top of the page beside the blob. What's so unhealthy about McDonald's food? So far as you're concerned, Mr. Preston, is McDonald's food unhealthy?
It's perfectly healthy. I eat it all the time.
Do you have a family, Mr. Preston?
I do. 2 daughters and a wife.
Do they eat it as well?
They do.
Do you encourage them to eat it?
I take them on many occasions alongside me.
And the next big subheading, how do McDonald's deliberately exploit children? Mr. Preston, do McDonald's deliberately exploit children?
Absolutely not.
Only one question in this column. It says that nearly all your advertising is aimed at children. Is that true or false?
It's not true.
Now, if we can cross over to the next column. Not a lot of children are interested in nutrition, and even if they were, all the gimmicks and routines with paper hats and straws and balloons hide the fact that the food they're seduced into eating is at best mediocre, at worst poisonous. Do you know of any evidence, Mr. Preston, that your food is poisonous to children?
No.
In this country, is the advertising which is produced for children governed by any kind of independent or other regulation?
Oh, yes.
Does your company have a concern to keep to the standards which are set by those authorities or not?
Not only do we keep to their standards, but we have our own code of practice which is even more strict than their own.
Which is called?
The McDonald's Golden Arches Code.
This may sound a silly question, but what is the purpose of Ronald McDonald?
He's a spokesman to children.
For what reason?
As an advertising symbol. He's a character that has become known and loved with children on many fronts, in an educational sense. Synonymous with McDonald's, the food, the fun involved.
Do you not consider it a cynical exploitation of children to use Ronald McDonald, a well-known clown, to drum up business for your company?
No.
Around the world in 30 seconds. And the great McDonald's balloon race is off. And it's Ronald and the Fry Guys.
When the chief marketing officer of McDonald's, John Hawkes, was called to give evidence, 30 television commercials were played back in the courtroom, some aimed at adults and some featuring Ronald McDonald aimed at children. Mr. Rampton questioned John Hawkes about these commercials.
In advertising for children, we don't sell in a direct way. We don't therefore show too much of the relationship between the characters and the food and selling the food. We use the advertising to entertain them. It makes them feel that McDonald's is a fun, colourful place that they would like to go to.
That being so, what do you expect or hope will happen next?
Well, we would hope that when the adult is eating out, or intends to eat out, the child will ask them to go to McDonald's.
Can I ask you a little bit about Ronald McDonald himself? Do you have any disquiet about the use of Ronald? He has some mates, doesn't he? Hamburglar and other people.
Yes.
The use of those characters to enhance your sale through the effect of those characters on children?
No, none at all.
Would you like to expand on that?
Well, two main reasons. One, we do nothing and have no personality traits within those characters that could pose a problem to the growing up of children. So there's no ethical problem so far as that is concerned. And secondly, the child does not make the overriding decision to visit the restaurant. The parent does that. The parent always reserves the right to say no to the child.
The defendants then called Susan Dibb of the National Food Alliance to give evidence about advertising to children on television.
One of the themes that some of McDonald's advertisements use is that of being socially accepted.
Can you explain a bit more about that then, please?
Yes. Children need and want to be accepted, to belong to a group.
Are you saying there's anything particularly wrong with these methods?
I think there are two issues here. There is the issue of if a food is deemed unhealthy, then to what extent should it be promoted to a child?
Are there other things?
Yes, the adverts that use collectibles. Kids do love to collect things, and McDonald's have recognised this, and with their Happy Meals, they provide a range of collectibles. These include little mermaid figures, Barbie dolls, sports buddies, McRobots. With each of these, there are typically 4 to collect, 1 a week.
So what are the concerns about that then?
Well, certainly if a parent has taken their child 1 week, the chances are the child will want to go back the next 3 weeks to collect the full set.
I don't know if there was anything you wanted to say about Ronald McDonald, for example. If not, was there anything you wanted to say about any of the other characters that are used?
Yes, I was going to refer to the character Hamburglar. The main purpose of Hamburglar in life is the acquisition of hamburgers. He isn't above borrowing them without a thought of payment. In fact, nobody expects payment.
So the problem is likely to be that children will copy his behaviour?
They may copy his behaviour, and to that extent I don't think Hamburglar's a responsible character.
Your National Food Alliance publication discussion paper, as you're pleased to call it, is headed Children, Advertisers' Dream Nutrition Nightmare. Way over the top, isn't it?
It has a question mark at the end.
You see, this paper of yours, you're coming, as I understand, the totality of your evidence so far. You will correct me if I've misunderstood it. From this place, Miss Dibb, are you not? That it's wrong to persuade anybody to eat anything that cannot be described as healthy food.
No, I have not said that. The focus is on children, as I've said before, because of the importance of diet during childhood, and also the fact that children do not, as we have pointed out, have the same abilities to assess what may or may not be in their best interests.
Is that really the key to your view? The children, they may be attracted to something by an advertisement. They have the facility to be strongly attracted without the balancing facility to realize what might be adverse to their interests in the product. Is that what it boils down to?
Yes.
And so too the most serious libel that McDonald's alleged against the defendants. When Paul Preston, the British Big Mac, first gave evidence, Mr. Rampton asked him about claims concerning nutrition, diet and disease.
Can we go back to this part of the leaflet, please, Miss Preston? It says, what they, that is McDonald's, don't make clear is that a diet high in fat, sugar, animal products and salt, sodium, in case anyone didn't know, and low in fibre, vitamins and minerals, which describes an average McDonald's meal. Pausing there. Does that, do you feel, adequately describe an average McDonald's meal?
It does not.
Goes on. Is linked with cancers of the breast and bowel and heart disease. This is accepted medical fact and not a cranky theory. Mr. Preston, may I ask you this? Do you have a concern as head of a very large food service organisation in this country that the food you are selling to your customers may be causing them heart disease, cancer and diabetes?
I do not.
Why is that?
The food we sell is made from beef, bread, milk, potatoes, chicken, eggs, lettuce, orange juice, mineral water. I find those commodities in every household I've ever visited. Eaten as part of a balanced diet, they're perfectly safe, perfectly healthy.
Has McDonald's ever published anything which contained lies?
Certainly not knowingly.
You wouldn't publish anything which you considered to be inaccurate?
Not knowingly.
Right, OK. Could you get volume 6, section A?
Whereabouts?
Number 4.
Good food nutrition, McDonald's?
Could you turn to page 12 of the document?
Yes.
Can you read the second paragraph on that page?
There is a considerable amount of evidence to suggest that many of the diseases which are more common in the Western world, diseases such as obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, stroke, and some forms of cancer, are related to diet.
Thank you. Do you feel happy that McDonald's published this document?
Yes. I think for its time, October '84, 10 years ago, it was probably a fair statement of what people knew and saw then.
Do you think it's accurate now?
I don't think it's the end-all, be-all. I think it depends on the expert you speak to.
What about heart disease?
Depends on the expert you speak to.
Cancer?
Depends on the expert you speak to.
May I remind your lordship that it may help to shorten matters that there is an admission in this case, an admission of fact to this effect by the plaintiffs. There is a considerable amount of evidence on a relationship between a diet high in saturated fat and sodium and obesity and high blood pressure and heart disease.
What about cancer?
No.
The admission that there was a link between diet and heart disease meant, or so it seemed to the defendants, that they had achieved their first victory, and so far as this area of the alleged libel was concerned, they had only now to establish a link between diet and cancer. McDonald's called a number of experts to testify that there was no such link. One of the first was Professor Wheelock, a university professor employed by McDonald's as a consultant on food and health policy. Mr. Rampton referred him to tables which set out the dietary content of various meals.
I've chosen a meal which I take to be a relatively average McDonald's meal. That is a cheeseburger, regular French fries, Diet Coke and apple pie. Is that a fair choice to have made?
I would think so, yes.
Professor Wheelock, provided he had sensible things at other times during the day, he could repeat that meal 7 times a week, 52 weeks in the year, couldn't he?
There should not be any problem.
If your meal is heavy in fat, saturated fat and low in fibre and high in sodium and sugar, does it make the rest of your diet harder to balance?
I thought we'd already established that. It doesn't matter whether it's McDonald's or anything else. It's an arithmetic fact of life.
It may be implicit in Miss Steele's questions that in order to have a healthy diet, you have to meet the recommendations day by day. And, rightly or wrongly, you don't adhere to that view.
No, I don't accept that. I'm not aware of many nutritionists who do.
That's partly because you think people don't eat at McDonald's every day.
I know people don't eat at McDonald's every day.
Nobody at all?
Helen Steele then introduced a London Food Commission survey on eating habits called Grazing in Peckham, which analysed how often people eat fast food like McDonald's.
32% said they were using fast food outlets once a day. If that was right, would that concern you? That people were eating that kind of food with that kind of frequency?
If what you are implying is that these people are eating a high proportion of foods which themselves are high in saturated fats and high in total fat, and this makes up a high proportion of their total diet, then, yes, I would be concerned.
What's your conception about junk food? This label, junk food, in our society?
Well, I think junk food is something the individual has to make up their own minds about. As far as I'm concerned, junk food is something I would not want to eat.
Can you give us examples of junk food?
Can I suggest one?
Yes.
Which may give pleasure to a lot of children. Candy floss at a fair.
Yes.
What would you think of that yourself?
Well, in my perception, that would be junk food.
Because it's basically sugar, just sugar.
It's partly because it's sugar. It's sticky. It's nasty. You get it all over your face. I wouldn't really want to touch it at all.
Is there any other example of junk food you wouldn't eat?
Semolina.
Did you say semolina?
Yes. The reason is I don't like the stuff.
So if you don't like it, it's junk food?
Yes. This is what I'm trying to say to you. It depends upon the individual.
So the definition of junk food isn't based on its nutritional value?
It might or it might not be. The overriding consideration is that it is personal.
So if people said McDonald's food is junk food?
It is not junk food in my book.
Millard, it is entirely accepted on behalf of the plaintiffs, and I make this clear now, that whether or not McDonald's may properly be described as junk food is entirely a question of individual opinion. What is objected to in this leaflet is not the suggestion that McDonald's is junk food, but that it kills its customers. Professor Wheelock, I'd like you to have a look at this. Millard, it's the leaflet complained of.
Yes.
I draw your attention to the following features. First of all, the heading set against the McDonald's Golden Arches logo. The heading McCancer. Do you see that?
Yes.
Then, do you see the word McDisease?
Yes.
And the word McDeadly?
Yes.
Well, you passed your eye down to the middle of the page to a cartoon, a drawing of a cow in a hamburger. Do you see that?
Yes.
And a cow is saying, if the slaughterhouse doesn't get you, and the person on the other side of the hamburger is saying, the junk food will. And I think in the middle of that pamphlet there is a column headed, what's so unhealthy about McDonald's food? Do you see that?
Yes.
What they don't make clear is that a diet high, and I stress the word diet, a diet high in fat, sugar, animal products and salt, and low in fibre, vitamins and minerals. Are McDonald's meals low in vitamins and minerals?
No.
Which describes an average McDonald's meal, is linked with cancers of the breast and bowel and heart disease. This is accepted medical fact, not a cranky theory. Every year in Britain, heart disease alone causes about 180,000 deaths. Professor Wheelock, as a piece of nutritional advice, given the headings and the cartoon to which I draw your attention, are these statements valuable pieces of nutritional advice?
In my view, they are extremely distorted and misleading.
Some of the later nutritional advice given by McDonald's, particularly as part of their overseas operations, emphasised surprising long-term benefits. When Peter Cox gave evidence for the defendants, he quoted a passage about Japan from a book written with the full cooperation of McDonald's called Behind the Arches.
Fujita, president of McDonald's Japan, decided to sell the hamburger to the Japanese as a revolutionary product. He gave lectures on it at universities throughout Japan. The reason Japanese people are so short and have yellow skins is because they have eaten nothing but fish and rice for 2,000 years, he told reporters. If we eat McDonald's hamburgers and potatoes for 1,000 years, we will become taller, our skin will become white, and our hair blonde.
When David Green, the Senior Vice President of Marketing for McDonald's in America, gave evidence, Mr. Rampton asked him to comment on Mr. Fujita's remark.
Do you know Mr. Fujita quite well?
I've met with him a number of times, yes.
Does he have a sense of humor?
He has a very wry sense of humor, and I can see him saying this with quite a smile on his face.
Whether Mr. Fujita was joking or not, Mr. Green was entirely serious when, under cross-examination, he expressed no worries at all about persuading Americans to eat McDonald's food as frequently as possible.
You mentioned that you were targeting your advertisements at heavy users of McDonald's, is that right?
Yes.
You also have a category you call a super heavy user, don't you?
Yes.
Is it true McDonald's makes attempts to focus on super heavy users?
Yes, it focuses on super heavy users.
Or SHUs, is that correct?
That stands for super heavy users, yes.
The SHU is a specific category that McDonald's has defined.
Yes, it is a specific category, yes.
Tell me, do you see any inconsistency between a McDonald's publication that stresses balance, moderation and variety on the one hand and the marketing angle that we must get heavy users and super heavy users coming to us more often if we can?
No. There are 21 meals a week or whatever, and I think it's very consistent that you can balance your meal occasions at McDonald's with other meal occasions.
In August 1994, when the hearing had already exceeded the 4 to 6 weeks originally estimated by Mr. Rampton, McDonald's executives flew over from America and made their first approach to settle the case out of court. They failed and flew back again. And even had they wanted it, the option wasn't open to McDonald's simply to pull out of the case on their own, because while McDonald's was suing Helen Steele and Dave Morris over this leaflet, Steele and Morris had now started a counterclaim libel action over this leaflet, which had been distributed in McDonald's stores and which described the London Greenpeace group as people telling lies. The battle had now become 2 trials in 1, with both sides suing each other for libel. When we return, do Big Macs seriously damage your health? In the autumn of 1994, the McLibel hearing continued with the evidence of McDonald's main expert witness on diet and disease.
And nothing but the truth.
Your full name, Sidney Arnott.
Sidney John Arnott.
Dr. Arnott said he'd been a specialist in the treatment of cancer for 20 years and that for the last 10 years he'd been a consultant at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Mr. Rampton asked him to comment on a number of scientific studies into the association between diet and cancer. These studies were summarized in an article published by the Imperial Cancer Research Fund in 1987.
Then there's a section about bowel cancer. Despite the plausible theoretical mechanisms, the positive geographical correlations and the results of animal experiments, the human evidence for fat as a cause of large bowel cancer remains weak. Do you agree with that or not?
I agree with that, yes.
The statements which the government puts or forces tobacco manufacturers to put on cigarette packets to the effect that cigarette smoking can kill you are, in your view, both correct and desirable, yes?
Indeed, yes.
Do you think it would be a good thing or a bad thing or a neutral thing if food manufacturers put on there, let us say, pork pies, this product may give you cancer? What's your reaction to that?
I think that is ludicrous, because there's no evidence, no scientific evidence that that is the case.
Dr. Arnott, isn't it a fact that many responsible international, governmental and academic organisations have said there is a link between diet and cancer, although the factors aren't known exactly?
I think what is true to say is that people have suggested there may well be a link between diet and various forms of cancer, although one has not been able to show that in scientifically conducted trials.
If we go to nutrition file pink 6, before I point you to that document, if I read this out, there is a considerable amount of evidence to suggest that many of the diseases which are more common in the Western affluent world, diseases such as obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, some forms of cancer, are related to diet. Would you agree with that considerable amount of evidence?
Yes.
Do you think it would be a reasonable position in 1985 and still a reasonable position?
If that is advice being given to the general public, I think it a very sensible advice to give, because, as I have already indicated, studies have been carried out that suggest there might be a relationship between fat intake and cancer.
That document is just it's actually in a file. It's a document produced by McDonald's.
What's it called?
It's part of...
Allowed. It's called Good Food, Nutrition and McDonald's. It's a United Kingdom document published in 1985.
Yes, thank you. Do you want the witness to look at this?
No, that's okay. That's finished with. I want to ask you about another document about advice to the public. A diet high in fat, sugar, animal products and salt and low in fibre, vitamins and minerals is linked with the cancer of the breast, bowel and heart disease. Is that a reasonable statement?
It has been linked, yes.
So it would be a reasonable statement?
It depends to whom it is being directed.
The public.
If it is being directed to the public, then it is a reasonable thing to say. But if it is being directed to the scientific community, one will be more careful in the language one is using.
This is a quote from the London Greenpeace fact sheet, which is the subject of the libel action.
The defendants believed they had now won on the issue of establishing a link between diet and cancer, as well as between diet and heart disease. But the battle wasn't quite over. After Dr. Arnott left the witness box 3 months into the hearing, McDonald's applied to change their original libel claim. If successful, the defendants would have to prove not just that the contents of an average McDonald's meal are linked with cancers of the breast and bowel and heart disease, but a much higher meaning, that McDonald's sell meals which cause cancer of the bowel and heart disease in their customers. Mr. Justice Bell was still considering this application when the defendant's first expert witness on diet and disease started to give evidence. He was Professor Crawford, the World Health Organization expert consultant on the role of dietary fats in human nutrition. Helen Steele began by taking Professor Crawford through his witness statement.
Right, just going to page 4, this is really dealing with some of the evidence given by other witnesses, where those witnesses have claimed that there is no proof that diet is linked to cancer.
No, my love, they have not said that. The witnesses have not said there is no proof that diet is linked with cancer. The word link should be abandoned, perhaps, for the purpose of these proceedings.
Yes. Use the word cause. I know the word links in the text, or medical facts in the text. It may be that Mr. Rampton will argue that if you use the phrase medical fact, that it hardens up link in some way. We have on the leaflet one of the arches with McCancer in it, so he's going to argue, it wouldn't surprise me, that McCancer itself means that McDonald's food causes cancer.
Obviously we're going to argue that the leaflet nowhere states that if you eat McDonald's food you'll get cancer.
Yes, I know you are, but the case you have to meet is that it's alleged against you that it does mean cause.
I just want to say, I think the plaintiffs are shifting their ground considerably.
No, don't bother about that. What I said to you about possible interpretation was that you didn't think it was automatic victory for you and defeat for McDonald's in this discrete area of the case if you establish link, whatever that means, rather than cause. That's all.
Professor Crawford was in the witness box only for 1 day and didn't complete his evidence, and the judge still hadn't decided whether the defendants had to prove a link or a cause when they called their next expert witness on diet and disease. He was Dr. Neil Barnard, president of the American Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine.
What are the problems with the kind of products
Yes, can I ask you to pause there? One of the questions in this case may be what's meant when you say something's linked with something else. That phrase, linked with. What's it mean to you?
It primarily means associated, that the two things go together, with an implication that there may be a role of cause, although it may not necessarily be a direct cause and effect relationship.
Dr. Barnard, can I read you a passage from a McDonald's document distributed or available to the public in 1985? There's a considerable amount of evidence to suggest that many of the diseases which are more common in the Western affluent world, diseases such as obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, stroke and some forms of cancer, are related to diet. Now, can I give you This thing. This is the outer sleeve of a packet of French cigarettes called Gitane. Can I hand it to you?
Yes, I see it's empty. So this is not an autobiographical glimpse, Mr. Rampton.
Absolutely not. Nor should it be taken as such. On the front, you find the name of the brand. And then, can you read out what it says in capital letters below the name Gitane?
Tobacco can seriously damage your health.
Yes. Now, will you please turn the sleeve over onto the other side and read out what it says?
Smoking causes cancer.
So it does. Now, what I want to know is whether you see a distinction between that statement about smoking and the statement about diet, which is in the McDonald's document of 1985. Do you see a distinction, Dr. Barnard, between suspicion and guilt?
The sentence in the McDonald's booklet seems to convey, at least to my reading, more than a suspicion, but less than conclusive evidence.
Thank you. If you wouldn't mind, if I may add an autobiographical note, I wouldn't mind that sleeve back, otherwise the contents will collapse in my pocket later on. Thank you very much.
Is that, strictly speaking, a medical fact? Smoking causes cancer?
It might be more accurate to say smoking can cause cancer, in that in many individuals it does, but in others it does not. But for some individuals it does cause cancer.
The defendants complained again that it was only because McDonald's had been forced to admit there was a link between diet and both heart disease and cancer that they were now trying to shift the goalposts. The judge disagreed, but later in the trial, 1 year later in fact, and after much deliberation, he ruled that the defendants had to prove that eating McDonald's food bears the very real risk that you will suffer cancer or heart disease as a result. It wasn't until 2 years later that new evidence was heard on this subject, and by then attitudes had hardened even further. Here is McDonald's expert, Dr. Sidney Arnott, 2 years later, at the start of his cross-examination by Helen Steele.
Do you have your statement in front of you?
Yes, I do, thanks.
The first paragraph reads, "Since my last report, the strength of belief of the direct relationship between diet and the development of certain forms of cancer has become less strong."
And here the defendant's expert, Professor Michael Crawford, also questioned 2 years later by Miss Steele.
Have you a copy of your statement in front of you?
Yes, I have.
Since submitting my first contribution, it is my view that the evidence relating diet to cancer and heart disease has hardened.
Mr. Justice Bell had decided that the scientific evidence was too complicated for a jury to consider, so it would now be for him alone to decide which of these two conflicting expert views was correct. When we return, are McDonald's responsible for the torture and murder of animals?
Then we go down to, in what way are McDonald's responsible for torture and murder? This appears, as you shortly see, to be a reference to the slaughter of animals. In the slaughterhouse, animals often struggle to escape. Do you know of any evidence on that score?
No.
Mr. Preston, if you had evidence that animals struggled to escape, that they became frantic, that their conditions of keeping and rearing were inhumane and cruel, what would you do about it?
If I found out that to be going on, I'd counsel the supplier. If I found out it to go on having been counseled, I'd terminate the supplier. He'd never sell to me again.
When the animals go up the runway, you can see the terror in their eyes when they approach the kill floor.
This is Howard Lyman, giving evidence for the defense about the slaughter of cattle in America. Formerly a ranch owner, he's now a convinced vegetarian.
The animals are stunned by what they call a captive bolt pistol. They stun the animal, drop him to the floor, hang it up by its hind legs, and then cut its throat, which is what causes death. Now, occasionally, an animal's not fully stunned, and when they drop it to the floor, the animal gets up. This usually happens several times a week. That animal is absolutely terrified, running around the floor. There is no doubt. Those animals go into the kill floor, know they are going to die, and they are not pleased.
Right, this general scene, does that apply to all or most of the slaughterhouses that you visited, both when you were a farmer and when you were making all these visits?
What I'm talking about is the absolute standard of the industry. Get them in as quickly as possible, kill them as quickly as possible. The idea of a humane slaughter absolutely does not exist.
Do you know what is the method by which cattle are stunned in this country before slaughter, before they are bled?
Yes?
What is it called?
They use a gun. It shoots them in the head. It stuns them completely. There's a technical term for it, but I can't remember it off the top of my head.
Perhaps I can help. It's the captive bolt system.
That's it, captive bolt.
The idea, as you said, is to stun them first before they are bled out and turned into meat. Now, is that a method which has been, as it were, I do not say approved, but that method is the one which is used, therefore, does it follow, for the bulk of the cattle which are used for McDonald's meat in this part of the world?
Yes, it is used here in this part of the world.
So far as you are aware, is that a matter which should be regarded as humane or inhumane?
It's the most humane method that exists.
Mr. Rampton asked Mr. Preston about an article in the Bournemouth Advertiser dated 12th of October 1989, in which a consultant pathologist was quoted as criticising the captive bolt method.
He says, that is the pathologist, it is a horrifying fact that approximately 1/3 of the cattle shot in this way are not stunned, but stand grievously wounded and fully conscious while the pistol is reloaded. Mr. Preston, do you have any information to suggest that might be so?
The statement is totally false. The captive bolt system is darn near perfect, nearly 100% accurate.
If it were the case that you discovered that the people who slaughtered cattle for McDonald's were using a method as horrendously inefficient as that, what would you do about it?
It would not work for me.
Does your company object to the attribution to it of approval of methods as barbaric as that?
Barbaric methods have no place involved with McDonald's.
Under cross-examination, Dave Morris reminded Mr. Preston that McDonald's had threatened legal action against the Bournemouth Advertiser. The defendants believed this to be yet another example of how McDonald's try to silence their critics, no matter how big or small.
The paper printed an apology approved by McDonald's, which read, McDonald's Restaurants Limited have asked us to point out that they do not approve of the captive bolt method and are highly concerned with ethical issues. But you do use the captive bolt method for supplies of your beef. Is that correct in this country?
I cannot speak for all of them. I assume that some must. The purchasing folks are the best to ask about that one, I'm afraid. Those details are not for me.
Dr. Gregory, you visited for the purposes of this case, I think, 4 establishments, did you not?
This is Dr. Neville Gregory, Senior Research Fellow of Food Animal Science at Bristol University, the main expert called by McDonald's to give evidence about animal breeding and slaughter in Britain. Mr. Rampton asked him about statements made in the London Greenpeace pamphlet.
Murdering Big Mac. In the slaughterhouse, animals often struggle to escape. In the slaughterhouse at Bowes, in the slaughterhouse at Midland Meat Packers and at the other plant, did you ever see animals struggling to escape pigs or cows?
Not that I could identify, no.
A recent British government report criticised inefficient stunning methods which frequently resulted in animals having their throats cut while still fully conscious. McDonald's are responsible for the deaths of countless animals by this supposedly humane method. Dr. Gregory, in your observation of the suppliers of McDonald's with meat from chicken, pigs and cows, did you find any evidence to support the statement that animals were frequently conscious while they had their throats cut?
In the case of cattle or pigs, it was never. In the case of frequently with chickens, I think the answer is also no.
Dr. Gregory had visited Sun Valley, a firm supplying McDonald's with poultry for processing into chicken McNuggets. And under cross-examination, Dr. Gregory agreed that chickens at Sun Valley were not provided with all of the basic needs set out in the official code of practice for the welfare of domestic fowls.
The chickens at Sun Valley, for example, don't have access to sunlight, do they?
That is correct.
They don't have much room to move around in either, do they?
Well, that's a bit of a general statement, isn't it?
18 birds per square metre. I measured this morning. What we're saying is that each bird has less space than the size of an A4 sheet of paper.
Okay, I haven't done the sums myself.
No, but just look at that. Does Miss Steele surprise you?
That seems realistic. When you walk through the birds towards the end of the crop, you have to be very careful where you're treading.
In terms of comparing between what a chicken's normal behaviour would be and what it is in a broiler shed, their movements are quite restricted.
Its movement is undoubtedly less in a broiler shed.
Severely restricted?
Not severely, it is just less.
And what about flying?
Well, the Gallus domesticus is not an adept bird at flying. In the adult lightweight laying hen, they are certainly more so, but broilers are not adept at flying.
Is one of the reasons why broiler hens might not want to fly because they've been bred to be very heavy?
Well, it may be that their wings are not powerful enough to sustain the weight of their body in flight. That is a possibility.
Is there any other natural behaviour they can't exhibit in the broiler unit?
I think if you had laying hens outdoors, they would spend a bit of time sunbathing. They do have a predilection, so it seems, to sunbathe.
As another example, chickens normally, do they have a family structure?
Well, that's a good point. In a family situation, there would be some parental care, and this would not occur in a commercial situation.
Helen Steele questioned Dr. Gregory about the slaughter of chickens and about a design fault in the electrical stunning process whereby over 13% of the chickens before they were stunned were exposed to an earlier pre-stun shock.
Under the slaughter of poultry humane conditions regulations, you see, it is an offence to subject the bird to unnecessary pain or unnecessary distress from the time of arrival at the slaughterhouse to the time of death.
Yes.
How many days a week does Sun Valley slaughter poultry, do you know?
To the best of my knowledge, it's 5 days a week with 2 shifts.
So if we're talking about 13.5% of birds getting pre-stun shocks, that's going to be quite a considerable number.
Yes.
It's going to be several thousand a day.
Yes.
Pre-stun shock may be negligible or it may be painful?
Yes, the question of whether it is painful. You know, you get a physical recoil from the shock itself, and, well, this is rather a loose term, the word pain. Some people do describe it as painful.
Do you consider it painful?
Yes.
It's something that will cause distress?
Oh, yes, it is alarming. Very alarming.
I think, just to put a figure on it, I think it actually works out at 17.5 thousand a day that will be receiving pre-stun shocks.
I don't know.
That's based on the total slaughtered at Sun Valley being 35 million chickens a year.
Helen Steele then asked about the stunning process itself, where the line of chickens shackled upside down by their legs have their heads dipped into a bath of water with electric current running through it. This process was intended to stun all of the birds, but Dr. Gregory found that some of them showed signs that they were still conscious when the line moved forward for their necks to be cut.
Going back to your statement, you said 0.7% of birds showed a reflex response. It's a matter of concern.
It is a matter of concern.
Right, because 0.7% of birds would represent 942 birds a day.
Okay.
Based on 35 million being killed a year.
Helen Steele then asked Dr. Gregory about the method of slaughter recommended by the RSPCA and favoured by Dr. Gregory himself, which ensured that the shock administered did not simply stun, but was strong enough to cause cardiac arrest and kill the bird as quickly as possible.
So you and the RSPCA agree that the best method would be to use the stun kill method?
I do.
Do you know why Sun Valley Poultry aren't using this method?
I do.
Why do they say they're not using it?
Because of trials they have done in their establishment at Hereford, which have shown that if they use high currents, which are inevitable to produce a cardiac arrest, it is associated with a higher prevalence of quality problems in the carcass.
So they're doing it for economic reasons?
Yes.
After slaughter, the line of chickens moves into a scalding bath for the feathers to be removed, but Dr. Gregory found that some of the chickens were still not quite dead.
At Sun Valley Poultry, you concluded that 1% of birds had residual brainstem activity at scalding.
Yes.
So, obviously, they are therefore alive.
Yes.
And the 1% of birds that weren't dead at scalding, that's around 1,350 each day. That's quite a significant number.
I understand.
So it's possible they could come round?
I have known of situations where birds have come around. They've been taken off the line at that point unconscious and then have come around subsequently. I have known this, but it is unusual.
But it is possible.
Yes, fair comment.
Over the following months, the court heard evidence about animal welfare and slaughter, both from McDonald's suppliers and from some of the top people at McDonald's. This is Edward Oakley, a senior vice president of McDonald's UK.
The whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Do you know what the codes of practice are in this country about stocking densities in broiler units?
Not specifically. I leave that to the experts at Sun Valley.
Are you aware that some valleys stock over the recommended stocking density?
We don't actually make the checks. The checks are made by the government health inspectors and the veterinary officers. If there was a problem, I'm sure they would have told us, and we would certainly deal with it if that were the case. That's why I'm very surprised that... I don't know where you got your information from, but I'm very surprised at that.
From Mr. Gregory. From the evidence of Mr. Gregory, who is McDonald's expert witness.
Well, I haven't seen that particular evidence. Mr. Gregory has certainly never made us aware of the problem.
So as far as McDonald's are concerned, you just bury your heads in the sand and assume nothing's happened?
No, of course not. We would know if there was anything wrong.
How would you know if you don't make the checks?
We've been through this now. You've made your point to the board.
Dr. Gregory said that of the birds he studied, 44% had leg abnormalities, yes? I put it to you, Mr. Oakley, that if chickens are forced to live within an A4 size of paper, and that during transportation many receive bruises and broken legs, some dying as a result, up to 14% of chickens receive pre-stun shocks, if that is the evidence of your expert witness, you don't care about animal welfare at all, do you? You haven't got the slightest bit of interest in the welfare of animals. You're only interested in making money out of those animals. That was a question.
Oh, was it?
I'm putting to you that you have no animal welfare.
The answer to your question is the same as it was earlier, and that is that it's our job to conform to the industry codes of practice. I'm not sure if the horror story that Mr. Morris referred to right there would be any different if the chickens came from a farmyard. Maybe even worse.
The next witness was McDonald's main expert from America on animal welfare. Dr. Fernando Gomez-Gonzalez was born in Mexico, took 3 top degrees at the University of Texas, and is now manager of meat products in McDonald's International Quality Assurance and Purchasing Department. He explained McDonald's worldwide concern about animal welfare during breeding and slaughter, and was then asked about egg-laying chickens kept in battery cages.
Have you thought about the animal welfare implications of keeping 4 birds in a cage for, I suppose, the duration of their useful lives?
Absolutely.
In a house, there is no access to fresh air or sunshine.
Yes, I have thought about it, yes.
They don't have the sun warming their backs in spring or early summer while they sit in a dust bath, do they?
Not the sun, that is correct.
You're waxing quite lyrical, Mr. Rampton.
My question was, and it was a serious question, was whether you had studied the animal welfare implications of a bird inside a house, inside a cage.
Yes, I have.
As opposed to a bird free to fly about, sit in the dust, sit in the sunshine, so on and so forth, and able to lay its eggs wherever it pleases within a given area, which I think is how we might describe a free-range chicken in this country.
Okay. I'm going to start by saying it is very difficult to get information from the animal. That you will understand. I cannot ask it. So, one way we can get very good information is by looking at the health of the animal. You can look at how the animal looks, how the animal stands. Look at the feathers, do they shine? You can look at the eyes. But there is one very good indication which will tell you everything, and that is the weight.
Weight?
The weight of the bird, whether it is a broiler or an egg-laying hen. Any stressed animal will suffer, and it will show in its appearance, and it will show in its weight. A happy hen, a hen that is not under stress, will look better and will have a better weight. If an animal grows in a cage from day one, they think that is their natural environment. Those birds that have grown in such an environment will not be significantly under stress. On the other hand,
A free-range chicken, when it is out, is subject to the environment, is subject to distress, because it could go hungry, it could not find its friends or relatives. It is subject to predators. They are more susceptible to diseases. So, when they are out in the open under uncontrolled conditions, they will suffer physiologically and they will be more susceptible to diseases.
Thank you for that answer, Dr. Gomez-Gonzalez. To what extent, in your experience, does additional weight give rise to problems like leg disabilities and things like that?
They do not have the same problems that a regular bird will have. They have been selected keeping in mind the health of the animal. It is not economically feasible to raise animals that are physically deficient. The profits will not allow it. The business would not survive.
You're associating gaining weight with being healthier. There's no reason why those two things should be automatically linked, is there?
There is a high correlation with that.
What else is there for them to do in their cage apart from sit there and put on weight? Eat and put on weight?
That is their environment. If I may clarify one thing that hopefully will explain my point. There is a distinct difference between humans and animals. If you look, and it has been fairly well documented in psychology books and research, a major difference between humans and animals is that we are aware. It is what is called an awareness factor. We know our position on this earth. I could see myself, I can envision myself out of this planet and look down from the moon and see the earth and see the continents and see the islands and know where I am. I know I am in court right now. I know I have the choice to go somewhere else. I know that something else is out there. Animals do not have that ability. That is the big difference.
How do you know they don't have that ability?
If you will let me finish. An animal who is born and raised in a cage does not know, it is not aware that there is an outdoors. It is not aware that he has a choice. An animal assumes that that is their environment and it will be comfortable in that environment. That is a fact.
Court, rise.
By the spring of 1995, the hearing had lasted almost 8 months. The defendants had been complaining that they were feeling under constant pressure, and on March the 6th, Helen Steele sent a letter to the judge explaining why her doctor thought she needed a rest and a break from the trial.
Mr. Rampton, I've received a letter from Miss Steele this morning. Attached to it's a letter from her doctor.
I'll read out parts if that's what you want me to do.
Yes, all right.
I've been suffering from stress as a result of the court case, and over the past month this has been increasing to a point where it's affecting my ability to present our case. Whilst we appreciate the provision of breaks for preparation time, I would also request breaks for a rest for the sake of my health. The attached letter's from my doctor to confirm this. I don't know whether you want me to read part of the doctor's letter or not.
Well, I think it's essential that those representing McDonald should know as much as possible. There's a reference to one particular condition which you've not referred to, and I do understand that. Why don't you read out the whole of that doctor's letter, except, I'm looking at line 5, the second, third and fourth words.
Dear sir, I'm writing in support of Miss Steele's request for more frequent breaks in her current court case on medical grounds. Miss Steele has been to see me.
After Helen Steele finished reading the letter from her doctor, the possibility of a break later in the month was discussed. But this was not to be the last time that the effect of stress on Helen Steele's health would become an issue during the course of this marathon hearing. So the trial continued. The final evidence for the defendants on animal welfare came from a man who, unlike earlier management and expert witnesses, had daily practical experience of working with animals bred for slaughter. John Bruton, who has difficulty reading and writing, was a poultry catcher at Sun Valley from 1987 to 1993. He was a member of a team of 5 whose job it was to catch and pack chickens into crates of drawers, which were then loaded onto a lorry. He said that the team was always under pressure to work as fast as possible.
Can you describe the catching procedure?
Catching procedure?
How were the birds picked up to be put into the drawers?
By the legs. One leg.
One leg. And how many birds would you carry in each hand?
6. Some would catch more. Some people have smaller hands and they catch less. Some people have bigger hands and they catch more. Once they was caught, they was thrown into a drawer.
What would happen to any sick or injured birds that were at the farms?
Well, if they was flapping about or running around or whatever, then they go into a crate and go to the factory. On a number of occasions, you'd see birds with broken wings and scabs on them. The farmer said, this is all part of our crop, it all goes to the factory.
So they were just loaded up like the others?
Yes, well, the only things that didn't get loaded into the crates is sort of what you call dead birds, or birds that had been dead and left in the shed for days.
How many dead birds were there usually in a shed?
150, 200 on average. Birds would be left in the shed with their brothers and sisters eating dead birds.
Could you tell how long they appeared to have been left there?
It's hard to say. Could have been hours. And if the air was really bad with a smell of gone-off birds, you could say they'd been there for a day plus, because they'd be rife and all swollen up.
Sorry, just going to the loading. Did it ever happen that birds' heads got trapped in the drawers?
Yes, on more than one occasion you'd be loading and rushing. And perhaps you might put your first 2 handfuls in a drawer, and the last one would just throw his in, and the chicken might be just having a look about. Well, I'm just using this as an instance. Sticks his head through the drawer, and the person shutting it never recognises it because of the time given. He just wants to shut the drawer and carry on with his work.
When you entered the sheds, before you started the catching, what was the reaction of the birds?
Once the doors is open, the birds is spooked. All rush down the other end of the shed, climbing down the sides of the walls, climbing on top of one another, causing smothering. Not so many dead, but where you was trying to dig them out, you'd find broken wings and broken legs.
When you started at Sun Valley, were you given any kind of training in how to catch or handle the birds?
None whatsoever. You went for your interview, and if you was lucky, you got a job, and you were told the time to start.
Mr. Broughton, did you ever kick birds and get them out of the way to make room for the crates or whatever they are?
Yes, I did.
Did you ever pick them up by the wings or the neck?
Yes, I did.
You know that kind of behaviour is directly contrary to the company's instructions, don't you?
Not really, sir, no.
You don't? I apologise for this question, but it is something the defendants told us earlier. Can you read?
Not very well.
Not very well. When you took your job at Sun Valley, was it explained to you that you must not pick up the birds by their wings, tail, or neck?
No.
I put it to you, Mr. Broughton, that what you have told is a mixture of lies and exaggeration.
Why do you say I'm exaggerating?
Because you were sacked by Sun Valley for dishonesty, for not wearing a hat, for obtaining company property by deception.
Where's the evidence that I have company property by deception?
Did the police visit your house on Saturday the 22nd of May, 1993?
Yes.
Did they find in your house, in an upstairs room, neatly stored in a cardboard box, 49 new, unused pairs of yellow-ribbed gloves that didn't belong to you?
That's not correct.
It's not correct. So they did find the gloves, but they were your property, were they?
Some of them was my property, yes.
The majority belonged to Sun Valley, didn't they?
That's not correct.
Did they find 9 pairs of overalls, 6 of which were brand new?
That's not correct.
What is not correct?
The amount of overalls that was new.
How many were new?
1.
Did they find 17 pairs of brand new white seafarer boat socks?
That's not correct.
It is not correct?
That's not correct. The number might be correct, but the make isn't right.
The make isn't right?
That's right.
Tell me about the make, then.
There was 2 different types of socks.
One make was seafarer, wasn't it?
Yeah, but not 17 pair of.
That's the kind issued by Sun Valley for use by their catching teams, isn't it?
That's right.
You were dismissed on the 26th of May, 1993, weren't you?
Yes. They got rid of us. Because they was looking to put contract teams in, and they was looking for excuses. It was not the case that this kit belonged to Sun Valley. It was an opening to say, this man looking for excuses, let's get rid of him.
You were angry, weren't you, that you were sacked that way?
Oh, I wasn't annoyed at having the sack. I was annoyed at the way it was done.
And that's why you're here to tell us this fanciful story about the way the birds were treated.
I don't think it's a fancy story. It's true to life. You ask me again in 20 years' time, I'll tell you the same. Because I've seen it with my own 2 eyes.
So I hear you say. I'm grateful.
Can I say one thing? Yeah. I'm stood here today accused of stealing. Now, could the people who have made those allegations to your worship there make those allegations to myself? And I'll see if I can get it sorted.
Thank you, Mr. Brewer.
Cheers.
But perhaps the last word on this issue should be left to David Walker, from whom we'll be hearing a good deal more later in the trial. Mr. Walker is chairman of one of McDonald's main meat suppliers and president of the British Meat Manufacturers Association.
As a result of the meat industry, the suffering of animals is inevitable.
The answer to that must be yes.
So both sides were agreed. Animals bred for slaughter must experience suffering. But McDonald's case was that whatever the suffering caused to animals reared for their products, this could never justify the claims made in the leaflet that McDonald's were guilty of deliberate cruelty and torture. When we return, what's your poison? E. coli?
Can we pass on in the leaflet down the second column and get to the box, what's your poison? Have we got that one?
What's your poison? I have it.
Among the claims made in the London Greenpeace leaflet was that meat was responsible for 70% of all food poisoning, and that when animals were slaughtered, bacteria from feces and urine could contaminate the meat. This, as we all now know, brings with it the risk of E. coli.
Leaving aside the one incident in Preston in Lancashire in January 1991, do you know of any other case in which anybody has suffered food poisoning in this country as a result of eating your food?
No.
The outbreak in Preston, it was quite a serious matter, wasn't it?
It was very serious.
In the 1991 outbreak, a number of people needed hospital treatment for severe medical problems after eating burgers from McDonald's store in Friargate, Preston. The main witness to give evidence for McDonald's about hygiene in the manufacture of hamburgers was Mr. David Walker, president of the British Meat Manufacturers Association and chairman of McKee Food Services. Mr. Rampton asked him what happened after animals had been slaughtered and were being de-gutted.
It's important that the intestines, or the guts, or whatever you like to call them, are not split or damaged during the course of this operation.
Very important. That's where the E. coli infection might come from.
You recognize you have a responsibility for your customers' well-being.
Absolutely.
Or the ultimate customers, anyway. It doesn't do your business any good if you're killing people on a regular basis, does it?
No.
That was not meant humorously. McDonald's insist that their meat is E. coli free, in effect. Is that right?
Yes.
Did you introduce, apart from testing for E. coli specifically, which in fact you started before the Preston incident, any precautionary measures as a result of the Preston outbreak?
Well, we changed our slaughtering technique by amending our hide specification in that the esophagus and the bung had to be tied off before the animal was eviscerated.
My steer anatomy is not that reliable, Mr. Rampton. I understand tying off the esophagus. But did you say the bung?
The bung. B-U-N-G, sir.
That's the other end.
That is the other end.
Other end.
The defendants asked for discovery of the records of McKee's daily contamination tests. But later in the trial, Mr. Rampton told the judge that unfortunately those records had been accidentally destroyed by Group 4 security. Over 30 days, witnesses from both sides gave detailed evidence about hygiene at McDonald's suppliers. The main witness for the defendants was Dr. Richard North, who had worked as an environmental health officer for 15 years before taking a postgraduate degree at Leeds Metropolitan University.
What are your concerns about specifically chicken and minced meat as used in burgers and food poisoning?
The general concern is the very high level of pathogenic microorganisms found in these meats. Once you start mincing, you distribute the contamination and bury it within the texture of the product, and therefore make it more difficult to kill when you apply surface heating.
Dr. North had visited McKee's and said that although the plant there was visually impressive, he was concerned about the method of transport of the meat from the abattoirs to the processing plant.
It comes in what I've learned to call combo bins, what I understand by some of the staff are called compost bins. Because what they have are these very square bins in which meat is squashed together, and you have the meat of many, many animals confined together in one pack.
They're actually the same shape as some makes of garden compost you can get at your local garden centre, so it mightn't have been anything to do with the food, might it?
Both in terms of visible description and function, because if you wanted to compost the stuff, that is certainly how you do it. It is not, in my view, the ideal way to transport meat. It does mean, inevitably, you are increasing opportunities for cross-contamination.
Dr. North then condemned the sampling techniques used at McKee's as empty rituals without scientific validity. McKee's took 5 samples from each combo bin for laboratory analysis, but Dr. North said that statistically 5 samples were nowhere near enough to be sure of locating a pathogen like E. coli.
So if Mr. Walker said in his evidence that the meat was free from E. coli 0157, what is your conclusion on that?
All one can say of that is McKee's have no way of knowing whether or not it is free from 0157 and are not carrying out any scientifically based programme which would enable them to give any such assurance.
But other witnesses, including Professor Michael Jackson, head of environmental health at Strathclyde University, who had visited McKee's on 2 occasions, gave evidence that the level of food safety control was highly satisfactory at all of McDonald's suppliers. When Helen Steele cross-examined Mr. Walker, she returned to the outbreak of food poisoning in Preston.
There was an outbreak of food poisoning in Preston in January 1991, wasn't there? Centred on McDonald's store in Friargate. That's been admitted by the plaintiffs.
There was an outbreak of E. coli infection in 1991, yes.
The admission says that in January 1991 a number of people suffered food poisoning after eating burgers from McDonald's in Friargate, Preston. McDonald's refused to admit responsibility despite a public health laboratory official report into the incident, identifying the company, which concluded that the problem may not have been completely restricted to a single branch or to a single hamburger chain. Survivors of the outbreak only received some compensation without admission of liability, that is by McDonald's. After strenuous and lengthy efforts, they've now admitted that.
They have not admitted it was in the meat.
If you could turn to the defendant's document, I think it's supplementary list number 22.
Well, I suspect this is going to be an inadmissible document, but I don't...
Helen Steele wanted to refer to a report published by the Public Health Laboratory Service following the Preston incident, but Mr. Rampton argued against this.
But I'm antipathetic to this way of proceeding, particularly when, by coincidence, no doubt, there is a member of the press in court this morning. The defendants... Oh, my lord, I am concerned about it. One reason why it's obvious the Preston incident was admitted was to prevent the defendants milking it for adverse publicity to McDonald's.
Yes, well, that may be, but I've never been a conspiracy theorist, and I see no reason to believe that things are just raised because there's a member of press in the court.
No, but, my lord...
Now, let's leave that to one side. The way round such problem as there may be is simply to put a suggestion to the witness based on the document we have.
I just want to say I'm concerned about what Mr. Rampton said about the fact that they've made an admission precisely to avoid publicity. Personally, I find that's an abuse of the court procedure, really.
If they've made an admission, I don't know why there's any resistance to having the issue looked into.
That's not right. Let's just follow the procedure. I've said.
Lord, Mr. Morris may not yet have grasped the effect of your ruling. What is admitted is that there was such a report and what its conclusion was, and that at the time McDonald's did not admit liability despite the findings of the report. The admission was made for the purpose of these proceedings and these proceedings only.
I want to ask something in relation to Mr. Rampton's last comment, which is he seems to be kind of retracting the admission, as it were.
No!
I don't take it to be that. It's a form of words which arises quite often in litigation, because And I'm not talking about this case. Someone might say, well, actually, I don't think I was liable, but this is only a £750 claim. I don't mind admitting I was liable because I don't want to spend £500,000 saving £750. But I'm not making an admission at large in the world because the next claim may be for, what, £4 million. And I may think it is worth spending £500,000 fighting the issue. But as far as this case is concerned, because the admission is made, you're entitled to treat what's admitted as fact.
For this case?
Yes. I don't know, I'm surprised. I would have thought you'd made an admission because it's the truth.
No. I'm sorry. Life's not quite as simple as that.
But even if McDonald's were responsible for an outbreak like that at Preston, this might either have been caused by food contamination during processing or by inefficient cooking at the restaurant. John Atherton joined McDonald's in 1982 and is now head of training, with overall responsibility for 4 departments at McDonald's. One of them, the Health and Safety Department, is concerned with the health and safety of both customers and staff.
Food safety. Can I ask you, as head of training, how you see your role in the McDonald's company?
I think the daily product check safety checklist would be a good example.
It's to be found in each store?
That is to be found in each store.
One notices that at each stage in the day, that is to say at breakfast, main menu, mid-shift and evening shift changeover, one of the items which is required is an internal temperature check.
That's correct.
Is that for all products?
It's for the beef and the chicken, the eggs on breakfast, also the sausages.
What is the reason for that?
To ensure that the product is fully cooked.
When was it introduced, do you know?
Not the exact date, but early 1992.
Early 1992. What instrument is used to ascertain the internal temperature of a product?
It's called a pyrometer within McDonald's.
Can we call it a thermometer?
Yes, a digital thermometer would be a good description.
The reason for making the check at the internal temperature is to ensure that it's at a temperature at which pathogens would have been killed. Is that right?
That's correct. Not only is the temperature checked, but the product is destroyed. Destructive testing, it's called. We rip it to pieces to ensure that every element of it is cooked properly.
Mr. North, the test that you saw conducted at the store for the efficient cooking of the products, how reassuring were the tests that you saw?
Essentially not terribly reassuring. It takes a great deal of experience to get an accurate reading from an internal thermometer. You start off with a very high temperature outside on the surface of the burger, and the temperature reduces towards the centre. It's quite a considerable difference. Bearing in mind the probes are manually inserted, slight variations in the depth to which the probe is inserted can have a considerable effect on the temperature actually measured.
The temperature away from the centre, is it likely to be higher or lower than the minimum temperature they're seeking when they do the internal tests?
More often, in the nature of things, the error is likely to go on the high side.
So, a temperature of 75 or 80 degrees? It may be that there are areas lower than that.
Indeed so.
Does this relate to your view of visual hygiene versus inherent hygiene?
That is very much the point. It is very often the case that premises may be brilliantly equipped, very clean, brightly lit, with staff extremely well dressed, very smart, purposefully managed. Yet, by the very fact of it producing a food poisoning case or cases means by definition it is not hygienic.
Dave Morris asked Mr. Atherton about an outbreak of food poisoning in Oregon in America in 1982, when 47 people, all of whom had eaten at McDonald's, were found to be suffering from poisoning caused by E. coli 0157. Morris wanted to know why the witness, whose job carried the responsibility for food safety in England, knew nothing of an outbreak in America which had predated the Preston incident by 10 years. The judge took this up with Mr. Atherton.
If it turns out to be a fact that the authorities who investigated the Preston outbreak and an outbreak in Oregon in 1982 came to the view that undercooking and or cross-contamination played a part in the responsibility for outbreaks of E. coli poisoning, you weren't made aware of that.
That's right. I wasn't made aware of that.
The question I want to put to you is, presumably, you get to hear things about the company history relevant to your job.
Indeed.
People will say, oh, you're in that department. Did you hear about such and such that happened?
Yes.
So why the hell don't you know about these important...
No, Mr. Morris, just put it as a sensible question.
Why don't you know? I'm sorry. I'm just getting a bit carried away.
Calm down. You managed to get through 98% of this trial so far in a perfectly civilized way.
I know, it just gets very frustrating sometimes. Does McDonald's have a blind spot about anything that is critical of the company?
No. I would say that anything that is critical is very much in focus and at the forefront of everyone's mind.
When Helen Steele continued the cross-examination of Mr. Atherton, she wanted to know how many incidents of food poisoning at McDonald's he was aware of.
I am aware that from time to time we will get a contact from a customer that suggests that they've had food poisoning at McDonald's.
Right, and how often does that occur?
Infrequently.
Can you give any useful estimate?
A useful estimate.
Per store, for example.
Alleged incidents of food poisoning by customers per store. It would have to be a complete shot in the dark. It may be 3 or 4, 5 a year. It may be more than that.
There was nobody from the press in court that morning, but there were members of a group of people calling themselves the McLibel Support Group, whose press releases had become an increasing source of irritation to McDonald's as the trial progressed. This group now made a simple calculation based on the number of McDonald's stores in the UK and released a report stating that McDonald's had admitted receiving at least 1,500 to 2,750 complaints of food poisoning each year. However, it was McDonald's case that any instances of food poisoning were negligible, given that they sold over 10 billion meals throughout the world each year. Helen Steele now took up the question of customer complaints about food poisoning with McDonald's Senior Quality Assurance Supervisor, Mr. Keith Kenny.
Serious complaints would be investigated by your company, would they?
Yes.
If it was alleged that someone had died as a result of eating a McDonald's hamburger, that would be investigated, would it?
I'm sure it would, yes.
You'd know about that, would you?
Yes, I would expect to know about that.
But you haven't heard about Wing Commander Derek Simmons in Knutsford?
When was that, sorry?
In 1991.
I've never heard of it.
If you could get Pink Volume 8B. Turn to tab 19, please. Can you just read that?
Okay.
This is a letter from some solicitors in May 1993. It says the cause of death of Wing Commander Derek Simmons was acute staphylococcal enterocolitis, yes?
Yes.
The solicitors allege that this was caused as a result of having eaten a McDonald's burger at 1 p.m. on February the 1st, 1991 at McDonald's outlet in Water Lane, Wimslow, Cheshire.
Yes.
Details are given to assist with McDonald's investigating this.
Yes.
But you're not aware of this?
No, this is the first time I've seen this.
If you'd seen this letter, would you have investigated it?
Well, yes.
So no one's ever brought anything like it to your attention?
I have never seen this letter before today.
If I put it to you that you do not, in fact, investigate all incidents of food poisoning, what would you say to that?
Can you just repeat that question, please?
It suggested to you that you do not, in fact, investigate all alleged incidents of food poisoning.
We investigate them to the extent that complaints are kept on a computer, and it would be true to say that every individual case is not investigated. But if there were more than one in the same restaurant over a similar period of time, then that would be investigated.
Those are the criteria for investigation, are they?
Or if somebody had been positively diagnosed as having food poisoning, there would be an investigation.
Is that because it's a law that you have to investigate it? If there are stool samples, for example, or it's recorded?
Yes, legally we'd have to investigate that.
McDonald's has been taken to court on a number of occasions, hasn't it? For selling undercooked burgers and other meat products.
They have been in court, yes.
Helen Steele then asked Mr. Kenny about 5 other cases when McDonald's had been charged with selling undercooked burgers or chicken McNuggets. McDonald's were found guilty in every case, but on appeal the verdict was overturned in 2 of them on the grounds that the company had shown due diligence and was therefore not responsible for freak occurrences or lack of care shown by a member of staff. The issue of due diligence was taken further by Dave Morris when Dr. North was giving evidence.
Just before we go on, do you think there's any relation between what you call ritualistic testing And the legal defence in food safety cases of due diligence?
Yes. The answer to that is clearly yes. It's become a game. A very cynical game in some industries where you saturate the environmental health authorities and the courts with massive documentation in order to claim due diligence.
When Mr. Rampton cross-examined Dr. North, he went through some of the witness's earlier publications, including a book called Chickengate, which he'd written in collaboration with Teresa Gorman, following the Edwina Curry eggs and salmonella controversy.
Under the heading, Keeping Things in Proportion, it says, statistically you have a much greater chance of developing food poisoning whilst in hospital than from eating sandwiches from your local corner cafe. Can I pause there?
Yes.
Would you agree that you also stand a far greater chance of getting food poisoning from sandwiches at your local corner cafe, made with cooked meat and kept in an unrefrigerated cabinet, than you do from eating a chicken McNugget at a McDonald's restaurant?
It's an awful generalisation. I couldn't comment.
It's a ham sandwich. What in Scotland they call cooked ham, right? It's been left in a sandwich in an ordinary cafe on a corner, in a piece of bread with some perhaps marge or butter on it.
Mr. Rampton, I'll accept your proposition.
I thought that was probably so.
But not all the evidence concerning food poisoning was heard in court. The key expert witness for McDonald's on this topic should have been Dr. C.F. Clarke from Strathclyde University. But at the last minute, Mr. Rampton decided not to call him to give evidence. Dr. Clarke's witness statement, therefore, became inadmissible evidence and couldn't be used in court. This irritated Helen Steele and Dave Morris, since this statement appeared to criticise McDonald's recommended cooking temperatures.
We're on page 11. It's about the internal temperature of the patties.
Mr. Clarke makes a suggestion.
No, my lad, he doesn't.
Can you point me to it?
Actually, he does.
Mr. Clarke recommends that 73 degrees be the internal minimum temperature of the final product, and that their final temperatures were not reaching that in all cases. Their minimum was, in fact, 70. He asked them to review their time and temperature conditions applied to meat patties. This is their own expert.
Both sides were at least agreed on this, that the ultimate protection against possible food poisoning from eating McDonald's hamburgers is a safe cooking temperature. McDonald's own expert had made a recommendation about a safe cooking temperature in his statement. But since the judge had accepted Dr. Clarke's evidence to be inadmissible, he won't be able to take any recommendation from it into account as he considers his judgment in this case. The trial had now been in progress for almost a year, and there were many more startling allegations to come. When the sewage system failed, did staff at McDonald's Store of the Year simply carry on cooking?
I can remember on at least 2 occasions sewage coming up through the floor vents in the kitchen and having to be mopped out of the way while we were working.
Were McDonald's managers taught to dock the wages of their staff?
What the practice was, if someone had actually done 42 hours, you would write down 41 or 40.
And do McDonald's have any responsibility for the destruction of the rainforests?
The Javanti Indians were moved out to pave the way for cattle ranchers. Some were actually taken out by plane. It was a very wild, rough area. I saw on a crossroads somebody being killed on one of these trips. It was real far west.
All this and more tomorrow night in the final rounds of the battle between Big Mac and Helen Steele and Dave Morris. Until then, good night.
As Sheena said, the McLibel trial concludes tomorrow, and that's at 7:30 here on 4.
Excuse me, can I have my change back, thank you? Food sold at McDonald's.
Quite often you would have complaints, people saying their hamburger was cold or sometimes raw meat.
Would you like to comment on that?
To my knowledge, raw meat was never knowingly served to customers.
I'm going to go through what I would call lies.
Well, I'm going to intervene now, partly because Mr. Morris has started playing to the gallery.
Cancer.
McLibel. McTorture.
McDonald's.
McLibel.
McRipoff.
We begin tonight's reconstruction of the McLibel trial with what was to become the longest trial in English legal history, now well into its second year. McDonald's was suing two anarchists from London Greenpeace, Helen Steele and Dave Morris, for libel over this leaflet. London Greenpeace should not, of course, be confused with Greenpeace International. Last night, we saw how witnesses on both sides dealt with claims made in the leaflet that McDonald's tortured animals reared for slaughter, exploited children by advertising, and sold food which bore the risk of causing heart disease and cancer. In tonight's programme, the court hears evidence about claims in the leaflet that McDonald's exploit their staff, that people who've eaten at McDonald's have suffered from food poisoning, and that McDonald's are responsible for the destruction of rainforests in order to raise beef for hamburgers. Because there's no legal aid in libel cases, Steele and Morris conduct their own defence in court. McDonald's are represented by one of the country's leading libel barristers, Richard Rampton QC. The judge, presiding over his first libel trial, is Mr. Justice Bell. In the witness box, the man who is proud to be called Mr. Big Mac in Britain, President of McDonald's UK, Mr. Paul Preston.
We pass on to another section of the pamphlet, which has to do with the way in which McDonald's is alleged to treat its workers. What's it like working for McDonald's? It says, workers in catering do badly in terms of pay and conditions. They are at work in the evenings and at weekends, doing long shifts in hot, smelly, noisy environments. Wages are low and chances of promotion minimal. Can I ask you to comment on the level of wages?
Well, it says wages are low. That demands comparison. Low compared to what?
What about the assertion that chances of promotion in McDonald's are minimal?
Absolute rubbish. Probably half our management people in the UK started as members of staff. I figure the number is probably higher in the United States, where we've been trading so much longer.
The most powerful member of McDonald's Corporation, the parent company in America, to give evidence at this trial was Senior Vice President Robert McKinley Beavers.
My first contact with McDonald's was 1963. I was a college student and started off as a part-time employee at $1 an hour.
Although you started off with the minimum wage, you were rapidly promoted. I'd like to ask how you found the working environment.
I found it challenging, exciting. It was, in my view, good preparation for a lot of responsibilities that I had later on. The store environment was an integrated one, and it was quite a learning experience for me.
By that, do you mean it was racially integrated, or do you mean in human terms?
Racially integrated.
Now, I'd like you to look at the pamphlet in front of you and turn to the 5th page. The truth is, McDonald's are only interested in recruiting cheap labour, which always means that disadvantaged groups, women and black people especially, are even more exploited by industry than they are already. As far as that concerns McDonald's, is that true or false?
That is false.
Mr. Rampton has set you up on a pedestal as someone who is black and has risen up the ranks of McDonald's as a shining example. Are you happy to take that mantle?
I guess I wouldn't characterize my situation as being unique. There are a number of people of color that have had an opportunity to start off at the minimum wage, work through the ranks, and now hold responsible positions throughout the McDonald's system.
Well, we've established McDonald's employs a great deal of black people and women. I mean, to put it in layperson's terms, I'm not being silly. Isn't a tendency that the shit work in society is done by disadvantaged groups?
My lord, could I ask what that means?
I know what it means.
My lord, I don't.
I know pretty well what it means.
What I'm saying is people can have different views. Obviously, someone who doesn't support the capitalist system, for example, may say that it's a reasonable statement to make, that McDonald's are recruiting cheap labour.
Well, no, the statement in the leaflet says the truth is McDonald's are only, that's my emphasis, so that you can see the word, interested in recruiting cheap labour.
Well, leaving aside the only then, would you say McDonald's are interested in recruiting cheap labour?
No. We try to recruit the very best people we can at competitive wages that are consistent with what the market will bear.
Without asking about your own individual salary, would you say it was fair to say that the salaries of directors and officers such as yourself are somewhere between $750,000 and $2 million a year?
No, well, I'm going to object now.
No. I listen carefully to any evidence that's called to compare McDonald's hourly rate with that of other industries, but for people doing comparable work and judging whether the pay is low. I can't see that the remuneration of executives has any relevance to the question of whether crew members receive low pay in the context of what's written in this leaflet. Now, that is a ruling which I now make so that it's understood throughout the rest of the evidence.
Do you think your wages are high?
No, I'm sorry. I made very clear my ruling. Concentrate, if you will, on the pay of crew members, which is what the leaflet's all about.
Yeah, and it's about low wages compared to the high wages.
Heard my ruling.
If I may say so, I think you've just made a judgment based on politics rather than...
No.
Because it's a matter of opinion what you're comparing something with. We're entitled to compare low wages with the high wages of executives.
You've heard my ruling.
I didn't realise you were going to make a ruling.
I'm certainly not making any political judgments in this case.
Yeah, but I didn't actually realise you were going to make a ruling and we weren't going to get an opportunity to present a full argument on it.
Abide by it, nevertheless.
The defendants argued that not only were McDonald's employees low paid, they were also encouraged to hustle or work as fast as possible, which could put health and safety at risk.
Just to save time, hustle is something that has emanated from McDonald's in the United States, the hustle policy, yeah?
Yes, it has its roots in our early days.
Are you aware that the hustle policy has been condemned by the health and safety executive in the UK?
I am not aware of that, no.
Well, that's the report that you have in front of you. It says in the top paragraph, the example of how hustle was interpreted demonstrates that health and safety were considered as secondary in the provision of quality service.
You know, I can't imagine my partners here in the UK normally want to violate any regulation or laws. I think the philosophy of having our employees work with purpose and dispatch is a good one. Doesn't mean compromising their safety or welfare.
You have competitions at McDonald's. You encourage competition between crew members for who can make the most money, who can do that the fastest, who can do this the fastest, don't you?
Competition for a job well done.
The reality is, the spirit of competition and the urge to increase speed is creating unsafe conditions for the staff, is it not?
No, it isn't.
And greater profits for the employer.
No, it isn't.
Do you remember the first National Hamburger Olympics around 1972, set up by McDonald's in Las Vegas?
Yes.
That was for McDonald's workers to compete in the stuffing of French fries, pouring of Coke, and flipping of hamburgers, yeah?
Yes,
and
sir.
get prizes.
Yes.
And that was employees from all over the United States in that competition.
We had regional competitions. The best were selected and participated in the trip. Those that made the final, they went to a banquet. There, in front of their families, they received recognition and rewards. As an anecdote...
And how important was it to work fast?
Well, it was much more than that. I was about to say as an anecdote. There was one gentleman who worked in the organization, a 17-year-old kid who was very timid. You know, if you went up to speak with him, he would, collapse. He really engaged himself in this all-American competition. He was the best of the best in his production area at his restaurant. He won the competition for the New York region.
Yeah, well, was this...
Let me finish.
Just say what the beneficial effect on him was, Mr. Beavers.
I am just trying to compose myself. You see, I am still a bit touched by...
Very well, very well. Just take a pause.
No, well, I was just going to say that his parents felt that. Just a minute.
Don't worry.
This individual did quite well. He felt, you know, he was able to demonstrate to all that he was the best there was in the production area. His parents broke down and cried at the banquet. He went on to become a store manager, an area supervisor, and up till recently, a franchisee, owner of 3 stores. He has been able to buy his parents a home and provide for his family in a fashion he could not otherwise have dreamed of.
Yeah, well, let's not talk about one individual. The fact is there are always going to be more people who don't get to the top, aren't there, than the ones that do make the top.
That is the nature of life. Not everybody gets to be vice president. Not everybody gets to be president.
At this point in the trial, Sid Nicholson moved from his customary seat in court to make his first appearance in the witness box and to give evidence on employment matters in Britain. Formerly head of personnel at McDonald's UK from 1984 to 1991, Nicholson is now a vice president and the company ombudsman. Before joining McDonald's, he'd been a policeman for 31 years, first serving with the Bechuanaland Protectorate Police and later working his way through the ranks of the Metropolitan Police Force to become a chief superintendent.
To what extent, if any, was your experience in the police force of use to you when you became at McDonald's head of personnel?
In some ways, extremely helpful, welfare particularly.
Of what?
Welfare particularly.
Suppose it was suggested that, in effect, McDonald's is a sweatshop, which exploits the young and the disadvantaged for its own profit. What comment would you have about that general proposition?
I would reject it out of hand.
Is that simply because you are a McDonald's person in a senior position giving evidence here in court?
No. My experience of organisations dictates to me that McDonald's is an extremely caring organisation.
During cross-examination, a film about McDonald's produced for Channel 4 called One Every Mile was shown in court, and Sid Nicholson was asked to comment on it. During the film, staff members attended a consultation meeting run by a supervisor, known at McDonald's as a rap session.
They make a lot of money, but the pay's not good.
The subjects covered and the views expressed during that rap session, were they fairly typical?
Yes.
So it's typical when the staff were asked, is there one thing you can do to improve the company, and they said pay, that would be fairly typical, would it?
It would be one of the subjects that often came up. It is not typical. It is not always pay, but pay is often mentioned.
Is it typical?
You show me any working man who feels he's getting enough pay.
Especially on the minimum wage?
I don't feel I'm getting enough pay.
Mr. Nicholson, could you tell us what you think trade unions are for, what their role is in society?
Negotiate wages, conditions of service, involve themselves in politics, support the Labour Party.
And provide information to their members about their rights. Do they do that?
I would accept that in some cases they probably do. I don't really know a great deal about trade unions.
If someone amongst the crew was a member of a union, or wished to be a member of a union, they wouldn't be allowed to inform the union about conditions inside the stores.
I don't see how we could stop that, unless, of course, we found out about it.
If you found out about it, sorry, informing outside organisations about in-store conditions is gross misconduct.
That's right.
A summary, sackable offence.
It is.
During the year from April 1995 to March 1996, more than 70 witnesses followed Sid Nicholson into the witness box to give evidence on McDonald's attitude to unions and employment practices. Stan Stein, McDonald's senior vice president in charge of human resources, spent 10 days in the witness box, being examined and cross-examined about labour relations worldwide. It was McDonald's case that no witnesses had given evidence of dismissals due to union sympathies or activities, that in Britain and America there had never been any great demand for union recognition, and that in some countries McDonald's restaurants were unionised. And it was while Stan Stein was still in the witness box in June 1995 that McDonald's revealed to the press that a second attempt had been made to settle the case out of court. McDonald's flew a team over from America again. They met with Helen Steele and Dave Morris, who told them their conditions. McDonald's must undertake not to sue anyone for making similar criticisms again, apologise to those they've sued in the past, and pay a substantial sum to a third party in lieu of the defendant's costs. Not surprisingly, McDonald's rejected those conditions, and the hearing continued. Now, crew members from stores throughout the country were called to give evidence about working for McDonald's. Tonight, we focus on witnesses from the High Street store in Colchester, which was elected Store of the Year in 1987. This is Mark Davis, Colchester manager at that time and now a McDonald's operations manager, responsible for 35 restaurants.
As you probably know, the defendants have said that they will call as witnesses some of the people who worked at Colchester during your time as manager. I want you to tell us if you can remember any of them. Mr. Simon Gibney?
Yes.
A lady called Kate Harrison?
Yes.
And a gentleman called Siamak Alimi?
Yes.
Do you see any of those people in court?
Yes.
Which?
Siamak.
Which is he, so we can know for the future?
He's the gentleman with the checked blue and white shirt on.
Then, Mr. Davis, labour costs. An allegation made in this case is that the company exerts pressure on its managers to keep their labour costs to a fixed figure. I think the figure of 15% is proposed by the defendants. What comment do you have about that?
The company never stipulated an exact labour percent to keep in line with. It was very much left to the local manager, in conjunction with the supervisor, to schedule to need rather than a fixed labour percent.
What would be the consequence, do you think, if you were chronically understaffed, so that your crew were bad-tempered, tired and grumpy?
The customers would not come back longer term.
Have you, in all your experience at McDonald's, ever come across a manager who was aiming rather at saving money than having the right number of crew for the right number of customers?
No.
Never?
No.
The court heard a rather different story when Simon Gibney gave evidence for the defendants. Gibney joined McDonald's at the age of 16, was promoted to shift manager at 18, then left after refusing a move to Milton Keynes. Dave Morris asked him about parts of his witness statement.
Well, this is section 3. For a period of 3 months, I was responsible for the staff schedule. This was calculated by looking at the day's projected takings. The total hours used was always below the allowed labour rate of 15%. Is that a true and accurate reflection of your experience?
Yes.
The Colchester store was set specific targets by the area supervisor, a man called Frank Stanton. In order to improve the yield performance of the store, he instructed the manager, Mark Davis, to water down drink syrups, ketchup, mustard, milkshake mix, cut the cheese slices into 2 pieces, one roughly half the size of the other, and to use the larger piece in the cheeseburger, which should have had a whole slice, and the smaller piece in a fillet of fish, which should have had half a slice. Make the staff squeeze the fry cartons when filling them and so on. Is all that correct from your experience?
Yes.
But Simon Gibney's allegations, reported to the press next day, were denied by Mark Davis.
Some allegations of dishonesty have been made against you. That you and Mr. Stanton conspired to water down syrups, mustard, ketchup, etc., etc., etc.
Definitely not.
Can you think of any advantage you might have obtained from doing that, on a scale which was at, as it were, to confer a commercial benefit?
It wouldn't confer any commercial benefit, because whatever product you consider, watering down of anything, say mix or syrups, would cause the customers to bring them back almost immediately. I see no benefit whatsoever to that practice.
And Gibney's accusation was also denied by Frank Stanton when he was questioned by Tim Atkinson, Mr. Rampton's junior counsel.
When you were area supervisor at Colchester in the mid-1980s,
Did you ever give instruction to the store manager, Mark Davis, to water down the drinks that were served to customers?
I did not.
Did you do that in relation to syrups?
No.
Ketchup?
No.
Mustard?
No.
Milkshake mix?
No.
Are you aware of that going on at Colchester?
No.
Would you have tolerated anyone doing that?
I would not have tolerated it.
Did you give any instruction to Mark Davis or anyone else to use less cheese in the burgers?
No.
Were you aware of that practice going on at Colchester?
I was not.
Would you have tolerated it?
Absolutely not.
What did customers think about the quality of food sold at McDonald's?
Sometimes, or quite often, you would have complaints. People saying their hamburger was cold, or sometimes raw meat. People would come back, especially with quarter pounders, because for quarter pounders to sear, you needed a lot of brute force to physically press the burger down on the grill plate to make it cook through before you turned it. And if you didn't have the strength, then the meat wouldn't be properly cooked.
What was the procedure to deal with that complaint?
Give a replacement.
Right. Did you ever fill in any forms?
No. No, I wasn't aware of any form there was to be filled in for that kind of thing.
As we showed in last night's programme, this allegation of undercooking was a serious one, since cooking to the correct temperature is acknowledged by both sides to be crucial in ensuring the prevention of food poisoning incidents, particularly those involving E. coli. Mr. Rampton asked Mark Davis for his comments.
How good, looking back, and it was the standard of hygiene and food handling in the Colchester restaurant in your time?
It was excellent.
The defendant's witnesses make a number of allegations about that. One which may be important I'd like to deal with is that raw meat was often served to customers. Would you like to comment on that?
To my knowledge, raw meat was never knowingly served to customers.
Do you think that might have been brought to your attention if it had happened with any regularity?
The customers would certainly bring it to my attention.
But Sia Makalimi, who worked for McDonald's from 1985 to 1987 and is now a university technician in information technology, also claimed that uncooked burgers were sold to customers.
If we go to the statement of Mr. Davies, in paragraph 10 he says, you allege raw meat would be sold. Did you say that?
Yes, raw meat in the middle, not absolutely raw, in the middle of the quarter pounder.
He then says, I'm sure I would have known of it. Customers would have complained. Do you have anything to say about that?
They did complain to the shift manager.
Did they complain to you, the customers?
No, they would not complain to me, no.
But you saw them complain to others?
Yes, I did.
But there was a further allegation from Simon Gibney.
You refer in your statement to blocked drains?
There was a specific problem at the Colchester store in that the filtering machine had broken, so that the oil fries had to be emptied much more often, because they were unable to be filtered. This caused the drains to block, and I can remember on at least 2 occasions sewage coming up through the floor vents in the kitchen and being mopped out of the way while we were working. On one occasion it was actually 2 inches deep, and we had got bun trays which are about 4 inches high, turned them upside down and stood on those in the kitchen area so the store could stay open.
You were standing on these trays on top of the sewage. What were you doing on these trays?
Cooking. People at the grill, people on the toasters, and people putting condiments into the burgers. They would all be standing on them.
Mark Davies had an answer to this allegation as well.
Do you remember anything about sewage in the premises at Colchester?
Not sewage as such, but I do remember the drains backing up on one occasion. The toilet sewage went down through a pipe and came out at the back of the restaurant. And also from the kitchen, there was a separate drainage system whereby water went down through the grease trap and met up with the pipe down from the toilet. On the occasion I remember it backing up out into the kitchen, the drains blocked at the grease trap bit, so it was more greasy water rather than sewage on that particular occasion.
What did you do about it?
First of all, it only came out just slightly in the back room, which is away from the food preparation area, so we just tried to mop it up and call Dynarod out to clean the drains. It fairly quickly became more widespread than that. As soon as it entered anywhere near the food prep area, we shut the restaurant.
For how long?
For approximately 2 hours.
Was that the only occasion when anything like that happened?
It's the only time I remember in all the time I was there.
But this explanation was contradicted by a statement from Mrs. Catherine Harrison, a McDonald's crew member from 1983 to 1989.
There were frequent problems with the filtering machine at Colchester. No one seemed to bother about getting a new one. Fat would be poured down the sink or drain. I remember occasions when this led to sewage in the kitchen area. I remember a couple of occasions when people mopped up sewage in the kitchen area whilst cooking and food preparation carried on. The store was not closed. Are you happy for that to be taken as your evidence?
Yes.
Mr. Rampton accused Sia McAlimi of malice and of masterminding the recruitment of witnesses to give evidence against McDonald's.
When did you hear about the Transnationals publication Working for Big Mac?
About a couple of months after I left, I would say.
You went straight to them and said, I think I can help you. I've got some dirt to spill about McDonald's.
No, not at all. I was interested in telling the truth to an organization which seemed to be doing research about what was going on behind the scenes at McDonald's.
You didn't like the way McDonald's worked because you found being asked to do cleaning jobs, things like that. You found that degrading, didn't you?
I find any job which is in your job description reasonable to do. I would not say it was degrading.
Do you remember phoning Simon Gibney shortly after you left McDonald's?
No.
You don't?
I have not been in touch with Simon since I left McDonald's.
There are, as you probably know, a number of people from that particular period that have signed statements of the defendants in this case.
Yes.
Was it you who got those together?
No, I have not seen any of them since.
The evidence concerning the Colchester branch moved into another gear with the appearance of Ray Coton. Now a savings investment advisor with the TSB, he'd trained as an assistant manager under Mark Davis at Colchester. Coton supported the allegations of earlier defence witnesses, but he also claimed that Davis encouraged him to pay staff for fewer hours than they worked.
You said you were taught to dock people's money so they did not get paid for all the hours they worked by altering their clock cards. You were taught to do this as an assistant manager by Mark Davis.
That's correct, yes.
To make sure I understand exactly what's being alleged about hours being docked off time and clock cards being altered, just exactly what was done. Can you tell me that?
In my time as an assistant manager, the hourly paid workers are actually paid on a manual clocking in card. So
yes, take it slowly.
Well, they have to come in, punch the clock card, clock out for their breaks, clock back in again, and clock out at the end of the day. It was then a manual job for the manager or assistant manager at the end of each day to physically add up with a calculator the number of hours worked minus the unpaid breaks, and then just write a total hour figure on the clock card. What the practice was, if someone had actually done 42 hours, you would write down 41 or 40.
Or 40, yes. And then what happened?
Well, what happened is...
what about the clock cards? Were they altered in any way?
Just the end totals will be altered.
Not an entry on the clock card?
No.
These practices were going on, were they, when the Colchester store was chosen as Store of the Year?
That would have been happening then, yes.
Also, the food watering down practices?
That would have been happening then, yes.
Mark Davis was promoted to area supervisor after Colchester won the Store of the Year award. Ray Coton took over as manager. But when cross-examined by Mr. Rampton, he claimed he was constantly at the end of criticism from Davis.
Are you saying this leads to an inevitable pressure to cut corners in order to achieve your targets?
There was always pressure. The pressure never ever stopped the whole time I worked for the company. Constantly, if you did well in one area, it would be, well done, but what about? It never stopped. It's deeply ingrained in the whole company, the whole way it works.
If you were right, Mr. Curtin, every manager in the country at McDonald's would be driven to cut the same corners that you cut, wouldn't they?
I would be very surprised if it didn't happen in other stores. I was only working in one store, so I can only comment on my particular situation. But it does seem that the only people that are saying wonderful things are the ones that are still working. The ones that have left are saying something's gone wrong. So there must be some truth in it there, surely.
Mark Davis was then recalled to the witness box to confirm his statement refuting the allegations made by Ray Coton.
Mr. Davis, is that the statement you made recently in relation to allegations made by Mr. Ray Coton in this court?
Yes, it is.
Were you here in court most of the time when Mr. Coton was giving evidence?
Yes, I was.
Are the contents of that statement true?
Yes, they are.
Thank you very much.
You carried out most of the training of Ray Coton, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
And that included training in watering down products and in docking hours in order to save labour costs.
It certainly did not.
The main thrust of the defendant's case is, in effect, that this was endemic in Colchester because of the pressure to meet targets. Then what I have to ask myself is, was Colchester a rogue store in this respect, either because Mr. Coton is a rogue manager and or because Mr. Coton and Mr. Davis are rogue managers?
And then there was the evidence which emerged during the cross-examination of Sid Nicholson about the rap session in the film One Every Mile.
Hours. I think, you know, they paid you for 60 hours. So I think they should get some of them more competent to do the job.
I did a lot of premium last week, last 2 weeks, and they only gave me 1 hour instead of about 6 or 8.
You said the subject matter in comments were typical. What about complaints about hours' work being under-recorded? Had you heard that many times before?
No, I wouldn't be concerned if that came up in a rap session and have inquiries made. I must say, however, I lost quite a lot of that conversation. The sound wasn't too good to me. Someone said they'd been docked 6 hours or something.
Oh, no, it was much more than that. Someone went as far as saying that they'd worked 6 or 8 hours overtime and had only been paid for an hour.
That is totally unacceptable. If that came up in a rap session, I'd have inquiries made immediately.
No detailed evidence was heard as to whether or not inquiries were made about the allegations in that rap session. And in reaching his judgment, Mr. Justice Bell will have to consider whether McDonald's supervision of labour practices is subject only to occasional aberrations, or whether these lapses were far more widespread, the inevitable result of the company's system of operation. When we return, the rainforests of Brazil, and the trial goes worldwide on the internet. On Friday, February the 16th, 1996, a website was launched on the internet by supporters of the defendants. The website, called McSpotlight, provided instant access to witness statements and clips of programs critical of McDonald's, as well as allowing anyone throughout the world to download copies of the fact sheet at the centre of the trial. The McSpotlight website later claimed it was accessed 174,000 times during its first week. When the court reassembled the following Monday, Mr. Rampton was irritated. He believed the defendants had been drumming up publicity for McSpotlight when they should have been working on documents he'd sent to them.
Well, I should say I find it quite extraordinary that Mr. Morris and Miss Steele haven't got themselves together for this morning. The reason why they couldn't consider this matter last Friday was that they were, what shall I say, conducting some kind of media entertainment.
I want to object to that now. If Mr. Rampton has any kind of proof...
When this latest skirmish in court was over, the next topic in the trial dealt with claims in the London Greenpeace leaflet that McDonald's were responsible for environmental damage, including the destruction of rainforests in Costa Rica and Brazil.
Can you turn over the page, please, and pass your eye down to the blob and the heading, "Why is it wrong for McDonald's to destroy rainforests?" So far as you know, do McDonald's destroy rainforests?
We do not.
Does McDonald's in the United Kingdom, or does it not, have a concern for the environment?
It most certainly does. It is born not only of being McDonald's and our concern, but I'm a parent too. We talked about my 2 daughters some time ago.
Does it matter to you whether there are any rainforests left by the time you're dead and your children have grown up?
Of course it does. I'm sure it will matter to them and my grandchildren. Hopefully I'll get a few one of these days. It's everybody's concern.
Does the company now have a policy on rainforests, a written policy?
We do? Yes, sir.
McDonald's corporate policy of not purchasing beef from former rainforest areas had relevance to one of the film clips now freely available on the McSpotlight website. This was part of a Channel 4 programme broadcast in 1989 called Jungle Burger, a documentary which claimed that McDonald's restaurants in America used beef from rainforest areas in Costa Rica. As a result of legal action taken by McDonald's, who cited their policy of not using beef from deforested areas, Channel 4 apologised in court and agreed to pay McDonald's costs. But Helen Steele and Dave Morris relied on the same film, which was screened in court, for evidence to support their case that beef from Costa Rican rainforest areas was exported to the USA. This interview, also available on McSpotlight, was with Sergio Quintana, marketing director of Co-op Montesinos.
Yes, because the type of meat that we produce has to comply with all the technical specifications that they need in the U.S.
And which fast food chains are you supplying by that way? Which ones?
We are supplying McDonald's and
Sergio Quintana did not give evidence, but he swore a witness statement claiming that the interview with him had been edited to give a false impression that he exported beef to McDonald's in the United States. This was denied by the director of the film.
I'm going to go through what I would call lies put out by McDonald's or McDonald's UK and see what you think. Are you aware McDonald's has used beef suppliers in some countries, for example Costa Rica, on land that was formerly rainforest?
Well, I'm going to intervene now, partly because Mr. Morris has started playing to the gallery. He cannot put a question like that since there's not a fair record to sustain what he has said.
It's in dispute as to whether it was formerly rainforest or not.
No, it's been admitted.
It's been admitted. The only question is, how long ago?
It's in dispute as to which parts ever were rainforest and if they were, when they were.
Manuel Jimenez's statement of McDonald's Costa Rica says, the cattle slaughtered to supply the company come from ranches in regions which were deforested in the 1950s and early 1960s, and, to the very best of my knowledge, this has always been the case. So, when McDonald's Costa Rica opened up in 1970, they were using supplies, some of which came from land cleared less than 10 years earlier. Do you agree with that?
No. He's talking about the early 1970s. That could be 20 years earlier.
Or it could be 10 years earlier.
It could be.
The McDonald's corporate policy statement also reads, it is McDonald's policy to use only locally produced and processed beef in every country where we have restaurants. But the defendants stumbled across evidence that appeared to contravene this policy in documents that McDonald's had given them by mistake. The documents showed that in 1983, McKee Food Services, who supply hamburgers to McDonald's in the UK, had on one occasion negotiated the import of 83 metric tons of meat from a company in Brazil, owned by the British meat magnate Lord Vestey. This was the only evidence of beef being imported from Brazil to Britain, but Dave Morris pursued the matter further with Edward Oakley, the senior vice president of McDonald's UK, first asking him about a letter sent from McDonald's in reply to a query from a customer in 1982.
No, I do not recollect that figure.
And the second paragraph says, McDonald's has a long-standing policy of buying all our products from the suppliers in the host country where we are doing business. Well, this is around the time, roughly, of the Brazilian beef shipment, isn't it? So it does seem to be that the Brazilian beef shipment was a transgression of that policy.
No, I think when this person is talking about the finished products that are supplied to McDonald's restaurants, she's not talking about raw ingredients.
It then says, as a result, we can assure you that the only Brazilian beef used by McDonald's is that purchased by the 6 stores located in Brazil itself. So what do we make of all that then?
What's the question?
Why not just ask, in the light of that letter, was the purchase of Brazilian beef in breach of McDonald's policy?
That's your question?
Yes.
No, it wasn't. We still bought the hamburgers locally. We didn't buy the ingredients locally, we bought the hamburgers locally.
In the spring of 1996, halfway through the evidence concerning environmental issues in Central and South America, there was a dramatic turn of events in court, sparked off by another application from McDonald's to change their libel claim. Their original claim had been that the defendants were liable for publication of the leaflet because they'd handed out copies of it on specific dates. Now, on day 228, almost 2 years into the trial, Mr. Rampton told the judge that McDonald's wished to change their claim and hold the defendants liable for publication on a far wider scale. To clarify the reasons for this application, Mr. Rampton fell back on the native tongue of the legal profession, Latin.
It's one of those cases where the old tag qui facit per, in this case it would be alio facit per se, is peculiarly apt to the facts of this case. Well, I don't want...
Mr. Rampton...
Oh, sorry. What it means is, who does things through others, does them himself. Different actual dates have been given for the defendant's personal acts of distribution, which now, if we were given leave, is a subsidiary consideration. And if we should prove the case, it will wither away to nothing because they would be liable for all publications of the leaflet within the jurisdiction up to the date of the writ. I don't know if I've said anything funny. Maybe Mr. Morris is making the jokes and not me.
Everyone should stay calm and respectful to the other side, because I'm not going to be affected by one side or the other.
A good case will always upset the other side. It may indeed contrive a different result from that which would have been achieved on the old pleadings.
The next day, Helen Steele complained to the judge that he'd given them insufficient time to prepare an argument against MacDonald's proposed change of pleading.
Please can I point out something? We're in court today, we're in court on Tuesday, we're in court on Wednesday, and I work at the weekends. And it's going to be extremely difficult for me to do any kind of serious preparation for a complex legal argument on an extremely fundamental issue before the 13th.
I'm going to adhere to what I've said, and I do not want any further discussion of it. You'll be ready to start on the afternoon of Wednesday the 13th.
Can I just say something? We're extremely stressed by this case. We've got a massive amount of work, and there are only such limits we can go to. I don't think that sufficient consideration is being given to the amount of work we have to do, the time we have to do it, and the amount of stress we're under. I don't know, I just don't think it's fair.
I have to form my independent judgment on this, and in respect of this matter, I think you can.
Do you want us to have nervous breakdowns? It's just ridiculous.
No, I don't want that, but I'm not going to be swerved from what I think is right.
Helen Steele left the court soon after this, and for the remainder of the day took no further part in the proceedings. The trial continued without Helen Steele for 3 days, after which she returned to court armed with a letter from her doctor, the same doctor who had written to the court previously about her health.
I'll hand up a copy of the letter with just solely the name and address of the doctor blanked out. I'll hand a copy to the plaintiffs as well. I don't have anything to hide. It's purely for personal reasons of privacy.
As Mr. Justice Bell read the letter from Miss Steele's doctor, he recalled what had been written in the earlier letter from her doctor, read out in court the previous year.
There's no harm in my reading out parts of this, is there, Miss Steele?
Of this letter, no.
The doctor refers to various stress-related illnesses, and there was a phrase I know was used last time. The doctor doesn't use the phrase, which I hope I've remembered correctly, which you didn't want read out in court and which you joined issue with anyway. Do you have any objection to me saying what the phrase was that was omitted last time?
Yes.
You really ought to help yourself, you know.
I do, because I don't agree with it.
Well, you virtually tie my hands behind my back so I can't do anything to help you.
But that's not fair. Last year you said it didn't add anything. To me, it doesn't add to anything. I mean, it must be apparent to everyone I'm suffering from stress. I don't normally carry on like this. I mean, it's not fair. I mean, how can anybody know what they're seeing with their own eyes?
I'm not prepared just to accept declarations in court when the litigant in person is in an emotional state.
It's in the letter!
In the event, the situation was resolved by Mr. Justice Bell ruling there should be a 2-week break in the hearings, not on grounds of health, but on the grounds that the defendants were not sufficiently prepared to continue with the hearing at that stage. And Mr. Justice Bell also resolved the issue of publication by ruling that MacDonald's could amend their pleading and hold the defendants liable for any and every publication of the leaflet. Then after the 2-week break, Helen Steele and Dave Morris returned to court to focus on Brazil. The court first had to consider a rather basic question. What is a rainforest? When Ray Cheska, MacDonald's Director of World Purchasing, was giving evidence, Mr. Rampton asked him for his definition of rainforest.
Well, besides its pristine beauty, breathtaking in many respects, it's characterized by tall, slender trees. I was going to say it looks like myself. When you leave the rainforest and move into a dense forest, and it's no longer a life-sustaining forest. Now, a life-sustaining forest is what is a rainforest. It creates its own cloud, its own rain, does not need us. But then you get the dense forest, which is starting a transition towards a dry forest, and then finally a dry forest into a savanna or a prairie and so forth, as you keep going south.
But when George Monbiot, a zoologist who has specialised in the study of environmental issues in Brazil, gave evidence for the defendants, he claimed that Mr. Cheska's definition was incorrect.
People perceive rainforest as the belt of woody vegetation going round the tropics, and that is how people talk about rainforest. It covers all matters of different habitats and types. If you were to take just about anyone from Britain and drop them by helicopter in one of those places and say, "What are you in?" they would say, "I'm in the rainforest."
Mr. Justice Bell later seemed to indicate the way he was approaching the definition of rainforest.
When a witness is in the witness box, what they cannot do is give evidence of what an ordinary reader of the leaflet would take rainforest to mean. It's an ordinary English word. As a matter of interest, it appears in the concise Oxford Dictionary, described in ordinary English words.
The concise Oxford Dictionary definition of rainforest is, in fact, luxuriant tropical forest with heavy rainfall. And if Mr. Justice Bell sticks to that definition, he'll certainly exclude any consideration of the destruction of dry tropical forests as he considers his judgment. And he'll have another knotty problem to consider at the same time. Must the defendants identify the exact location of the rainforest areas that McDonald's are alleged to be directly responsible for having destroyed in order to raise cattle? This is what Mr. Rampton said they must do, and he was dismissive of their written submissions against this.
Let me take, if I may, the first two lines. Brazilian beef, some originated from cattle raised on ex-forest land, blah, 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 has been supplied by McDonald's. The defendants don't seem to realize what a gigantic country Brazil is. Mato Grosso and Goiás. Which parts of Mato Grosso and Goiás? How close are they to ex-rainforest land? How do they become ex-rainforest land, and so on and so forth?
I'm not so sure, you see, because it's put on the general basis of the knock-on effect.
Yes, but
What Mr. Morris is saying is, it doesn't matter if you're some way away from the rainforest. It has a knock-on effect down the line. Now, at the end of the day, I may or may not think much of that, but is it not at least arguable?
It's arguable in the sense that it's an interesting general proposition. But, my love, this is supposed to be a defence to an action by McDonald's. It's not supposed to be a seminar on environmental studies. I do notice, for all their claims to be environmentalists, how remarkably ignorant the defendants seem to be on the subject, but there it is.
I object strongly to that.
My love.
The Bar Council prohibits insulting remarks by members of the bar against other parties.
Yes, quite right. I withdraw it and apologise. Well, that being so, yes, of course, it's an interesting topic of conversation. But one has to look at what the actual material is that is available to refine that interesting general discussion into a case against McDonald's.
Dave Morris tried to establish that case against McDonald's when cross-examining Ray Cheska, who held that none of the places where McDonald's obtained their cattle were areas he regarded as rainforest.
You see Barra do Garças on the border of Goiás State and Mato Grosso, yes? Where there's a meat packing plant, yes?
Yes.
The area north of there. Do you know of the large-scale indigenous population and there have been land disputes with the cattle ranching industry in that area?
What's this got to do with McDonald's?
Not since I've been involved, no.
Mr. Rampton said, what's it got to do with McDonald's? Nova Xavantina, which is in that area, is a region that supplies McDonald's. Do you know that area includes tropical moist forest areas as well?
Where are you now?
North of Barra do Garças.
What I know, this is not tropical forest, tropical wet forest, this area.
You've been there, have you?
Well, I've been at that plant, yes, here in, I've been in Barra do... I can't even read it on my map.
Do Garças.
Yes, do Garças.
But you haven't been to Nova Xavantina, have you?
No.
But we have a witness who says she has.
Okay.
Susan Branford has studied conditions in Brazil, both as an academic and as a journalist, for the past 30 years. She'd just returned from the Amazon when she entered the witness box to give evidence for the defendants. She told the court that over the years she'd often travelled through Brazilian areas where cattle ranching had caused deforestation, including the states of Acre, Goiás and Mato Grosso. The northern part of Mato Grosso was the area where Nova Xavantina was located.
The area around Nova Xavantina. Have you seen forestry clearance in that area?
Yes, I know this region particularly well. Between 1975 and 1983-4, I saw this region changing. When I first went, it was a long and quite arduous journey through, again, what I call tropical forest, which is humid tropical forest. Across the years, I saw cattle ranches being set up in this region and forests being cut down to pave the way for pasture.
Just pause a moment, please.
Can I continue? The term Nova Javantina actually comes from the Javante Indians. The Javante Indians were moved out to pave the way for cattle ranches. Some were actually taken out by plane. It was a very wild, rough area. I saw on a crossroads somebody being killed on one of these trips. It was real far west. A lot of conflict going on between cattle companies and peasant farmers. It was one of the most violent regions I knew.
Nova Chavantina was one of the places where Braslo, the sole supplier of hamburgers to McDonald's in Brazil, had obtained some of their beef. But McDonald's argued that this area was not true rainforest. The state of Acre, even further to the west, was without doubt true rainforest country. So did Braslo also get beef from McDonald's from Acre?
One of the most active companies was the meat-packing group Bourdon. We personally saw forests being cut down by Bourdon employees and gathered evidence from peasant families that they'd been forcibly evicted from their plots by Bourdon employees.
When you say cattle have on occasions been brought down by truck from Acre, have you seen that process?
Yes, I have seen trucks coming down that road. You frequently see them with Bourdon written on the sides of trucks coming down south from Acre. And it is general knowledge that they're on the way to Campo Grande, which is the nearest slaughterhouse that Bourdon have in that region.
During his cross-examination by Dave Morris, Ray Cheska confirmed that Bourdon delivered cattle to the plant at Campo Grande where McDonald's suppliers, Braslo, obtained some of their beef. But it's McDonald's case that due to prohibitive costs and practicalities, it's implausible that any cattle from recently cleared rainforest areas have been transported over long distances. McDonald's maintained that the evidence for any beef from rainforest areas ending up as beef for their burgers is so slim that it's virtually non-existent, and that they've always had a policy not to use beef from rainforest areas. The defendant's case is that the evidence they've produced in court is just the tip of an iceberg, that McDonald's rainforest policy has only existed since 1989, and in any case has been ineffectual. It's Mr. Justice Bell's task to decide who is right and who is wrong. When we return, how McDonald's hired private detectives to infiltrate London Greenpeace. Mr. Justice Bell had decided to leave the most crucial question of all until the very end of the trial, whether Helen Steele and Dave Morris could in fact be held in any way responsible for the publication and distribution of the What's Wrong with McDonald's leaflet. As the trial began to build to a bitter climax, Mr. Rampton wanted Mr. Justice Bell to take into account a separate London Greenpeace publication, which set out the background and aims of the group.
This is something I read out to you in opening. I'm on the second page, under the heading Campaigning.
Yes, I see.
Perhaps the most successful campaign we have initiated in recent years has been the one against the McDonald's Hamburger Corporation. This has become a nationwide and worldwide movement, uniting many disparate campaigners in the aim of smashing a multinational that epitomizes everything we despise, a junk culture, the deadly banality of capitalism.
The same leaflet describes London Greenpeace as an anarchist group and was to figure prominently when Paul Preston was cross-examined by Helen Steele about why McDonald's decided to take legal action.
It says in that document, we are going to smash McDonald's. This is a primary objective. In there is a statement about alignment with animal liberation, and at the same time in the British company we had 4 or 5 bombing incidents.
You read the leaflet, that's it, is it?
I discussed with Sid Nicholson the need to attend these public meetings you spoke of in your documents. I told him people should be attending these meetings. And whatever these people do, whatever they can find out, should be conducted in a proper, legal, constructive manner. But I fully intended to stop further publication of this document.
When Sid Nicholson gave evidence, he claimed that he, as well as McDonald's head of security, had seen Helen Steele distributing leaflets outside McDonald's head office in Finchley at a demonstration in October 1989. But Nicholson also hired 2 firms of inquiry agents to infiltrate London Greenpeace. And McDonald's relied upon the evidence of 4 agents from these firms to establish that Helen Steele and Dave Morris were among the key members responsible for the publication and distribution of the leaflet at the centre of the trial. Brian Bishop had infiltrated London Greenpeace, pretending to be interested in environmental issues, and attended many of the group's weekly meetings. Mr. Rampton asked Mr. Bishop about a meeting that took place on August the 9th, 1990.
You say, I arrived at 1930. Or as we say in English, 7:30 p.m. Present were Jonathan, Jane, Alan from Catford, Charlie and Mark.
Unknown to Brian Bishop, Alan from Catford was in fact Alan Clare, one of the other investigators. And Clare, of course, had no idea that Bishop was also an undercover agent. So of the 6 people present at the meeting, 4 were London Greenpeace regulars and 2 were undercover agents.
Then you say, this meeting lacked the direction of last week, probably due to the absence of the leading members of the group. I had the impression that no one present wished to be definitive, because whatever they said would be overruled by the non-existent hierarchy if the latter disagreed. Then there's what I take to be a comment of your own. So much for anarchy.
Yes, it was.
Can I ask you, at this stage, 9th of August, 1990, can you remember who you perceived to be the leading members of the group, or, as you ironically put it, the non-existent hierarchy?
Paul Gravitt, Dave Morris and Helen Steele.
In your statement, you talk about Mr. Morris, myself and Paul Gravitt being the most vociferous. That wasn't in your notes. Do you know where that came from?
That would have been my general impression of the whole group.
But we're talking about 3 years later, because it wasn't in your notes. And it wasn't until 3 years later that you made your statement.
Yes, I agree.
So what was the impression from?
My impression from, in that case, my memories at the time of the occasion.
Helen Steele also cross-examined a 3rd private detective, Alan Pocklington, about his account of the role that she and Dave Morris played at London Greenpeace meetings.
You've made a reference in your witness statement to it being clear from the meeting of November the 16th, 1989, that myself and Mr. Morris were core members. But that wasn't in your original notes of the meeting, and in fact, Mr. Morris wasn't even there. So it couldn't have been clear to you during this meeting.
It says during the course of this and other meetings.
Yeah, and this. I.e., it was clear during this meeting and other meetings.
Well, that's not the way I read it. It doesn't say that. It says during the course of this and other meetings.
The agents gave evidence for 2 weeks, and the court heard how one of them broke into the London Greenpeace offices to take photographs, how letters were, as another agent described it, purloined to provide evidence, how a 3rd agent, known only as Shelley, who didn't give evidence at the trial, had begun a relationship with one of the group members, and how other members were followed home after meetings to find their home addresses for the delivery of the writs for this action. Because in September 1990, Morris and Steele weren't the only ones to be handed writs for libel. 5 members of London Greenpeace were originally sued by McDonald's, but 3 of them backed down and apologised in court, and withdrew all the allegations made in the leaflet. One of those named in the writ who apologised was the next witness to give evidence on behalf of the defendants, Paul Gravitt. Helen Steele read his statement into court and asked him to confirm his account of the demonstration in October 1989, when both Sid Nicholson and McDonald's head of security claimed to have seen her handing out leaflets.
You say, I was on the picket at McDonald's headquarters on 16th of October 1989, and I do not think any fact sheets were taken or handed out on that day. Also, I don't remember Helen handing out any leaflets at all.
Yeah.
Helen Steele then asked Paul Gravitt about the private investigator's note of the meeting on January the 18th, 1990.
She admitted to helping with all anti-McDonald's information leaflets and their distribution. Have you ever heard me say anything like that?
No. I mean, you didn't... Helen didn't start coming to London Greenpeace regularly until 1988. Well, that was nearly 2 years after the fact sheet was published, so there's no way you'd have said that. No. He's made that up.
Dave Morris asked Paul Gravitt about the private investigator's notes of the London Greenpeace meeting of March the 1st.
On the top half of the page it says, helped organise the 1989 McDonald's Fair. Have you got any comments on that?
Well, that's complete rubbish. You didn't. Because I know. Because I did.
And helped produce the leaflets for the anti-McDonald's campaign. Great involvement.
Completely wrong. You weren't greatly involved. You weren't involved at all, in fact.
And the last thing I want to look at is the 20th of September 1990, Brian Bishop, I think, about people organising a picket of Kentucky Fried Chicken on Seven Sisters Road, and Dave Morris stated he was getting too old for that kind of thing.
You were the elder statesman of the group.
Yes, this is the last question. Mr. Gravitt, you got a writ from McDonald's. You were one of the people who originally got a writ from McDonald's. And in 1991, an apology was entered on your behalf for the criticisms made in the London Greenpeace fact sheet.
Yeah.
Why did you make that apology?
I made the apology because at the time we were given advice that we could not get legal aid. And without barristers, it was unthinkable to fight a libel case on our own. If we lost the case, we'd be bankrupted. Well, that's what we were told, so that's why I apologised. I didn't apologise because I thought the leaflet was lies.
And what was your view about the leaflet at the time?
Well, my view of the leaflet was, as it is now, that I'd stand by it, you know? I think it's accurate.
During cross-examination, Mr. Rampton asked about the role that Dave Morris played in London Greenpeace.
Dave Morris was already a member by the time you joined.
Well, it was part of the group when I joined, yeah. But as I became a more regular attender, I noticed his attendance got less. That was from 87 onwards.
You described him this morning as some kind of elder statesman, didn't you?
Off-the-cuff witticism.
Mr. Gravitt, off the cuff is sometimes more reliable than under the sleeve. Elder statesman's quite a good description, isn't it?
Dave used to come along to the meetings and talk about the history of the group and what he'd done in the past. I've never denied that McDonald's was one of the campaigns of London Greenpeace, but, you know, it was one of the campaigns. And certain individuals took part in it and others didn't. And Miss Steele and Mr. Morris didn't.
No, Mr. Gravitt. No.
Am I to understand that answer? You're saying that Miss Steele and Mr. Morris didn't take part in the anti-McDonald's campaign, or have I misunderstood you?
Well, by any part, they were not, as I can remember, involved in organising. I mean, Dave was only coming to meetings, rarely. Now, Helen did take part in the anti-McDonald's campaign in 1989, so if you want to say include that as part of the campaign, yeah. But, I mean, no way was this a group effort. My involvement in it was on a totally different level to anyone else's in the group. I was the anti-McDonald's campaign.
How many people attended the picket on the 16th of October, 1989?
Don't remember accurately.
25?
Something like that.
So you weren't on your own, were you?
No.
When the final witness for the defendants, Jane Laporte, gave evidence, Mr. Rampton asked some personal questions about Helen Steele, which would set the stage for his later cross-examination of her in the witness box.
Do you agree with me that you will often get in a temper when she's at the losing end of a decision or an argument?
I can't actually recall if I've ever seen Helen in a temper. Not with me. You know, I don't think I've seen her in a temper, as it were, with anyone else.
Do you agree with me that she has a somewhat sharp tongue and a way of putting people down?
No.
You don't?
No.
You do not then agree that she is a forceful and somewhat intimidating character?
No. I don't find her intimidating.
Mr. Rampton had now made it clear in court how he regarded his opponent, Helen Steele. When we return, the shootout between the barrister and the barmaid, and Mr. Big Mac faces his final grilling. On Monday, July the 8th, 1996, day 275 of the trial, Helen Steele finally entered the witness box. And when she did so, since the defendants had no barristers acting for them, it was to give evidence alone and on her own behalf.
I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence which I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. I'll start with my statement made on the 12th of July 1993. Since about 1982, I've been involved in various activities and campaigns to change society so that people and animals and the planet we live on are not seen just as the means for a majority to make their profits. Is it okay if I sit down?
Yes, do keep your voice up when you're reading. Don't go so fast.
Right.
Helen Steele then dealt with the allegation that she'd handed out copies of the fact sheet on the 1989 Worldwide Food Day.
On the 16th of October 1989, I attended a picket of McDonald's head office in Finchley. I do not remember handing out any leaflets on this picket. 3 years after the event, I didn't want to categorically 100% say that I couldn't have handed out a single copy of the fact sheet. It's my firm belief that I didn't hand out a single copy of the fact sheet, but 3 years after the event, it's impossible for me to say. There were some comments put to Miss Laporte about my character the other day. If I've been somewhat short-fused on occasions, then I wouldn't like it to be indicative of how I am normally.
Under cross-examination by Mr. Rampton, Helen Steele agreed that she'd attended 33 London Greenpeace meetings between October 1989 and September 1990. Mr. Rampton suggested McDonald's was discussed at 23 of these meetings, but Helen Steele said those discussions were of minor significance. Mr. Rampton then asked Miss Steele about the London Greenpeace Aims and Ideals leaflet.
Taking action is vital, because in the end, deeds, not words, really matter. That's why we support groups such as the Animal Liberation Front who break the law. Am I right that 2 members of your own group were charged in relation to an incendiary device at a Debenhams store at Luton, not including you?
I don't see the relevance.
Well, the relevance, Miss
If you
Steele...
want to ask me whether or not I personally support non-violent direct action, the answer is yes.
Including burning down a store at the cost of £11 million? Or was it 8 million?
I don't support any activity which would harm members of the public or anybody else.
Do you remember an 8-minute video that you and Mr. Morris made sometime?
We did not make it. We were filmed.
You were featured in it, shall I say that?
We were filmed.
You remember towards the end of the tape, there was a shot of Mr. Morris addressing the crowd through a megaphone.
There may be.
You've got the photograph album there?
Yes.
You look at the first photograph.
Yes.
There are several placards with the words, "Fight Censorship, Smash McDonald's," aren't there?
Yes.
Then turn over the page, please. This is a slightly different message saying, "Save the forest, smash McDonald's," is that right?
Yes.
Now there you are at the head of the procession. It's a protest march, presumably against the proceedings in this case, wasn't it?
It was a protest march against McDonald's and their attempts to silence their critics.
Do you dissociate yourself with sentiment, "Smash McDonald's"?
I would like to see a world without multinationals, and that includes McDonald's.
So the London Greenpeace anti-McDonald's campaign, which was being heralded as a huge success even by the time you joined it, must have seemed like manna from heaven to you.
It was a campaign I was involved in. I mean, I've attended hundreds of demonstrations and pickets on a wide range of issues, and McDonald's happened to be one of those.
You must have thought the fact sheet, so-called fact sheet, was one of the best things you'd ever read, am I right?
It was interesting.
Yes. And I'm sure you embraced it with enthusiasm, didn't you?
I don't know what you mean, to be quite honest.
Are you saying, Miss Steele, that it's in character for you to sit by when something is being done in the name of a group with which you are associated, of which you do not approve? Is that part of the Steele make-up?
If it had been something obnoxious or offensive, then I probably would have said something. But when I read the fact sheet, it all seemed to be stuff that I'd heard before, so there wouldn't have been any reason for me to say anything about it.
The impression you've been trying to give, we've all seen how you've reacted to the progress of this trial, and I'm certainly not going to rehearse in open court.
Mr. Rampton is giving evidence. He should ask specific questions about it, because I could give evidence about that, about the incredible patience he's shown over the past 5 years.
You're not giving evidence either.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, Mr. Rampton, sitting throughout this trial has taken a great deal of patience. Bearing in mind the obnoxious comments that you've made throughout it, the provocative remarks, the grunts and groans and rude remarks and what have you, I think, in fact, both of us have been extremely patient.
And was that why you turned the air blue, was it? When you lost your transcripts appeal in the Court of Appeal?
Turned the air blue?
F-words and C-words by the string.
It's rubbish.
That's not true.
No, that's not true.
Do you remember attending a hearing when you were ordered to give particulars of your rainforest case within 7 days or else you would be struck out? Do you remember that?
No.
Do you remember the hearing was attended on the plaintiff's behalf by Mrs. Brindley-Codd?
No, I don't remember.
So you don't remember after it was over, outside the court, Mr. Morris shaking his fist in Mrs. Brindley-Codd's face and you standing on the touchline screaming, "Collaborator"? I
don't know where you get your stories from, but they're just not true. I've never seen Mr. Morris shake his fist in anybody's face, least of all Mrs. Brindley-Codd's, and I never shouted, "You collaborator," at Mrs. Brindley-Codd either.
As far as myself is concerned, I don't believe I have a case to answer. Having heard all the publication witnesses, I would like to get some advice, but my inclination at the moment is that I don't need to go into the witness box, and I don't want to go into the witness box for that reason.
Well, it's entirely a matter for you.
The next day, Mr. Morris informed the judge that he had decided not to enter the witness box. But he'd overlooked one important legal problem. Earlier in the trial, Mr. Rampton had made a surprise disclosure.
This is an affidavit sworn by Mr. Morris on the 31st of August, 1995. And that paragraph 2 of the affidavit reads, "In 1990, McDonald's Corporation issued a libel writ against myself and a Ms. Steele, a separate party. This arose from leaflets we had produced." And of course I emphasize the word we and the words had produced. "Concerning inter alia the nutrition of McDonald's food, their employment practices and the effect of their operations on the environment."
The affidavit was prepared for Mr. Morris in another court case concerning an unwaged centre in Haringey, which, because of the McDonald's trial, Mr. Morris couldn't attend. Morris said that there was a mistake in the affidavit, and that he had in fact sworn a second affidavit correcting produced to allegedly produced. However, since he hadn't entered the witness box, the judge ruled that he wouldn't be able to take the second affidavit into account when considering his judgment. Towards the end of the trial, Dave Morris tried to retrieve this situation. He knew that McDonald's could only win on all the other issues if they could first prove that he and Helen Steele had in fact published and distributed the What's Wrong with McDonald's leaflet. And if Mr. Justice Bell had decided to hear the publication evidence at the beginning rather than at the end of the trial, he might have avoided presiding over the longest trial in English legal history. Dave Morris now expressed solidarity with the judge, who, he speculated, might be feeling pressure to find in favour of McDonald's in order to justify the 2 years spent hearing all the other issues.
About publication going to the end of the case, I remember you made a comment fairly early on in the trial about the absurdity, if publication was not proven, about it being heard at the end. I think what's important is that we both feel that you shouldn't be under any pressure not to find for us on publication, because it does seem the whole trial has been absurd if we win on publication.
Yes. I don't see myself succumbing to the pressure. It's a perfectly valid point for you to make.
Right. I was trying to be as diplomatic as possible.
The one issue we haven't dealt with so far is the question of the defendant's counterclaim, in which they were also suing McDonald's for issuing 3,000 leaflets as well as press releases labelling them as liars. It was Paul Preston, Mr. Big Mac, who had initiated the case against Steele and Morris and who had authorised the McDonald's pamphlet which accused them of telling lies about McDonald's. And it was Mr. Big Mac who had to face his final grilling by the two defendants. First, Dave Morris, who started by asking him to look at a McDonald's press release.
If you can look at that third blub, if you like. The leaflet in question contains many lies about McDonald's.
Yes.
And the word lies is repeated in the last word of the fifth blob.
Yes.
Dave Morris quoted 7 instances in the McDonald's press release, which, he said, accused him and Helen Steele of distributing lies.
Seeing as you authorised this press release attacking the credibility of myself and Ms. Steele for distributing lies, can you name just one thing in that fact sheet we knew to be a lie, if in fact we did?
I believe you knew the rainforest story to be untrue. I believe you know we do not exploit children, and that we are not responsible for murder, or McTorture, or McRipoff. I believe the whole thing, if I read your aims and objectives document, and look through further publication of material. The objective was to smash McDonald's at any cost, regardless of the facts.
Can you name just one sentence in that fact sheet I knew to be untrue?
I believe you knew the whole thing.
Do you ever wonder why groups campaign against McDonald's?
No.
You don't wonder?
No. Why would I wonder about that?
Do you ever stop to think that all these people who are campaigning against McDonald's believe that all the criticisms they are making of the company are true, and that is the reason why they want to expose what the company is doing?
But it's not true. And that's why we're here in this court before this judge.
The reason that people criticize McDonald's is because they believe the criticisms are true.
I don't know if that's universally so or not.
You'd accept that it could be so?
It could be so.
Right. And that it could be so in relation to myself and Mr. Morris?
No. Not having read the aims and objectives of London Greenpeace.
You've said in your statement that despite the fact that you've provided us with numerous documents and witness statements refuting, you say, the allegations in the fact sheet, that the defendants throughout the litigation have persistently reaffirmed the allegations in the leaflet. Do you just assume people are going to believe what you say as soon as you say it?
No.
You are aware that there are plenty of contrary statements in this case, that we've got 65, 70 witnesses on nutrition, experts on rainforests, experts on advertising, ex-employees, who are all saying basically that the criticisms are justified.
That's a matter for his lordship. He has to sort that one out.
So there it was. 313 days. An extraordinary and unenviable marathon record for a libel trial. Did McDonald's come to regret they'd ever brought the case to court in the first place? Will the judgment be as weighty as the hearing was long? These questions must wait for answers until next month at the earliest. We hope you've enjoyed our attempt to compress 300 and more days into under 3 hours. Good night.
Excuse me, will that be here or to go?
Next on 4, the Kirov Ballet, once the pride of the Soviet state, is now in crisis. Dancing for Dollars takes an intimate look at its glorious past and the recent scandal that has scarred its reputation. That's after the break.
You're watching Channel 4.